Westminster veteran Greg Hands. The latest reaction from Number 10 and the view of David Cameron's former Chief of Staff too. In the other headlines today, sentencing a monster. The Metropolitan Police officer David Carrick, who'd admitted 49 sexual offences against women, including dozens of rapes, is now being sentenced by a judge. Well, this is the picture at Southwark Crown Court. Mrs Justice Chima Grubb is dealing with the sentencing. We have to warn you that they are graphic details, so we won't be bringing you all the details, but certainly as the sentencing is concluded, we'll have Mark White, who's outside the court, to update us. Then in Turkey, the death toll now rising above 5,000. Britain sending search and rescue specialists and dog teams. We'll have the latest on the ever-growing tragedy and the efforts to help those in the rubble. And the nurses still on strike today in England. If you had to have an operation or procedure cancelled as a result, email us at gbviews@gbnews.uk and we'll try to get you on the programme too if you've had problems. But before that, let's get the latest news headlines. Tamsin is waiting for us.
Mark, thank you. Good afternoon from the GB newsroom. It's 2 minutes past 12. Rishi Sunak has revealed his new cabinet following a reshuffle this morning, whilst creating 4 new departments. Greg Hands takes over as the new Conservative Party chairman after Nadhim Zahawi was sacked. The Business, Trade and Culture departments have been broken down into separate units, with Grant Shapps now Secretary of State for a new energy security and net zero department aimed at securing long-term energy supply and bringing down bills. Kemi Badenoch is the new Secretary of State for Business and Trade. Lucy Fraser has become the Culture Secretary, taking over from Michelle Donlan, who's been made a new Science and Technology Secretary. Well, let's cross live to Westminster now, where our political editor Darren McCaffrey is following developments. And Darren, quite a lot of change here and a bit of remodelling. Just what does this mean for Rishi's government? Take us through it.
Yeah, I would say this is not just about superficial change. It's about the Prime Minister trying to show where his priorities now lie. Clearly, energy security has been welcomed by many across the board, even within the Labour Party, that there's going to be a focus on this now, with Grant Shapps taking over that department. But also a focus on science. And we know the Prime Minister has made a point time and time again about trying to make the UK a science powerhouse. And that Greg Hands, who takes over from Nadhim Zahawi, mind the pun here, he's seen as a safe pair of hands and someone who is a good campaigner, someone, frankly, the Conservative Party could do at the moment, given the positions in the polls. The big question, though, is how much will this change the course of politics over the next 18 months? And that seems far from clear at the moment. The Cabinet, the new Cabinet with those members, due to meet at 3 p.m. this afternoon.
OK, Darren McCaffrey, our political editor, thanks for now. Thank you. In other news, Turkey's President Erdogan has declared a state of emergency for 3 months in 10 cities impacted by earthquakes. It's after eastern Turkey was struck by a third earthquake this morning, measuring 5.7 on the Richter scale. The number of people killed across the country and Syria has risen to more than 5,000. The first 7.8 magnitude quake hit in the early hours of yesterday morning, with a second major earthquake measuring 7.5 just a few hours later. Almost 6,000 buildings have been destroyed in the tremor and aftershocks. Rescuers continue to dig through the rubble in search for survivors. Journalist Iona Sakufakis told GB News about the rescue efforts in the Turkish town of Adana.
Adana, this city is one of the most affected ones. It's one of the 10 most affected cities in Turkey. Right now, if you can see behind me, right a second ago, they actually found someone. The teams here that just managed to get someone out. And they're just taking him to the ambulance.
An underwater search for missing mother Nicola Bulley is still underway in the River Wyre. It's been 11 days since Miss Bulley went missing after taking her dog for a walk in St Michael's on Wyre in Lancashire. The search follows a fresh appeal by her partner, who said her 2 daughters desperately miss her and need her back. Forensic search specialist Peter Folding says they need to rule everything out.
Somebody could have put put the phone on the bench. Somebody could have found it and put it on the bench, just on the nearest bench. We don't know. Nobody knows. This is a complete mystery, this whole thing. And normally, if somebody falls in the water, if Nicola went in here, her body would have gone straight to the bottom. It would remain there, and police divers would have found her that day.
The BBC chairman has denied giving Boris Johnson financial advice before getting the job at the broadcaster, calling their relationship broadly professional. Richard Sharp has appeared for questioning before a cross-panel party of MPs this morning. It's after it was revealed he was involved in helping secure Mr Johnson a loan of up to £800,000 before the then Prime Minister backed his appointment to the role at the BBC. His selection is under investigation. Shadow Climate Secretary Ed Miliband is calling on the government to bring forward a proper windfall tax on energy companies after BP announced its biggest yearly profit in history. The energy giant has more than doubled its earnings from the year before, earning £23 billion in profits in 2022, after energy prices surged due to the war in Ukraine. BP Chief Executive Bernard Looney says stronger plant reliability and a lower cost of production helped with profits. The Shadow Defence Secretary is to argue cuts to the British Army must be halted to show the UK is a leading European member in NATO. In a speech at the Royal United Services Institute today, John Healey will outline Labour's plans to ensure the UK's duty to the alliance are fulfilled in full. It follows Defence Secretary Ben Wallace conceding the armed forces had been hollowed out and underfunded. This is GB News. More from me shortly. Now, though, it's back to Mark.
Tamsin, thank you very much indeed, and welcome back to GB News Live. Now, we are going to take you back to Southwark Crown Court, but we will not be bringing you the summing up before sentencing for Mrs Justice Chima Grubb in detail, because we have to warn you, some of the detail is very graphic. There are also legal considerations about the identity, of course, of the rape victims. But just to remind you, Mrs Justice Chima Grubb, there you can see, is sentencing Carrick, the former Metropolitan Police officer, for 49 offences, including 24 counts of rape against a dozen women over a period of 17 years. Now, in detail, the judge told him that the convictions represented a spectacular downfall for a man charged with upholding the law and empowered to do so, even to the extent of being authorised to bear a firearm in the execution of his duty. Of course, you remember Carrick was actually a member of the Diplomatic Protection Command. The judge going on to say, behind a public appearance of propriety and trustworthiness, you took monstrous advantage of women. You brazenly raped and sexually assaulted a number of women, some very brutally, and you behaved as if you were untouchable. You were bold and at times relentless, trusting that no victim would overcome her shame and fear to report you. The judge went on to say, for nearly 2 decades, you were proved right, but now, she said, a combination of those 12 women, by coming forward, and your police colleagues, by acting on their evidence, have exposed you and brought you low. The judge went on to tell Carrick, you have lost your liberty, your job, and your status. You have before you the prospect of a difficult time in custody for many years. Well, Carrick is in court. The court camera, however, cannot show him in the dock. 48-year-old former Metropolitan Police officer in the dock wearing a dark suit, white shirt and tie. And this proceeding being televised. So just to remind you, we won't be listening in detail to the judge's comments because they are very graphic. And of course, many of you will be finding that upsetting. But let's now speak to our Security and Home Affairs editor, Mark White, who's outside the court and has been listening to these 2 days of comments in the court. Mark, as we were saying, very graphic detail underlining, as the judge said, the monstrous crimes carried out by this man.
Yes, Mrs. Justice Chima Grubb doesn't make any apology for the graphic nature of what she is imparting. There have been absolutely horrific ordeals that those 12 victims have had to endure, and the full graphic nature of that, of course, has been detailed to those participants in this court process, not through the trial, of course, because he pleaded guilty before this came to trial, and this has really been the only opportunity for those victims, for their stories, for the ordeal that they suffered over 17 long years. This man had this horrific reign where he preyed on women, charmed them initially, then that charm turned to the brutal reality of the rape that he was basically involved in perpetrating on a number of occasions against these 12 victims, using, of course, his status as a police officer. His very first victim, Mark, he tricked this woman into coming back to his home. He'd met her in a pub in 2003. She was unsure whether to go back to his home. He'd told her that, look, you could not be in safer hands than with me. I'm a Metropolitan Police officer. And she was reassured by that, went back to his home, but then wanted to leave. She was no longer interested in this man, but there then unfolded the most horrific ordeal for this young woman as she was repeatedly raped, and at one point a black handgun was taken from underneath the bed that the defendant was on and placed against this woman's head, and clearly that was absolutely terrifying and horrific to add to the already brutal rape that she had to endure. So that is just one of multiple counts that the judge has been detailing here. As you say, you know, those details just too graphic really to bring.
Indeed.
We will later on in the sentencing process, Mark, be hearing from the judge more on the issues around the technical reasons why she is coming to the sentence that she will come to, whether it is, you know, life with a minimum term of whatever it might be, how she reaches that, taking into account the aggravating factors, and there are many, as we said,
Indeed.
and of course some of the mitigating factors, the fact that he has pleaded guilty before it's gone to trial, that he has apparently shown some remorse, and of course the fact that he did not kill any of his victims.
Yes, of course, the judge having to measure those aspects, as you say, before passing sentence. But just to give an indication, of course, of what the storyline is, one woman telling the court that she'd encountered evil in the shape of Carrick. Now, just to update people, Mrs. Justice Chima Grubb has said a little more to the court, saying Carrick had shown an astonishing degree of moral corruption, listing the key themes in his offending, including asserting authority, enacting extreme domination over his victims, and then, of course, she highlighted the reluctance of those victims to report the offending because of their knowledge of his status as a police officer. Now, Mark, obviously, Carrick was actually sacked by the Met in January for gross misconduct. And then the force apologising for failing to identify and remove him. But Mrs. Justice Chima Grubb in court then actually praising the 12 women who'd come forward and then her police colleagues to actually provide the evidence to actually bring him to justice.
Yes, the judge really highlighting the difficulties involved in the culture of trying to ensure that rape allegations are properly dealt with and are put before the courts. She said with regard to that first victim, the young woman who had met David Carrick in a pub, had been persuaded to go back home with him and had undergone that terrible ordeal, including, of course, that handgun being pressed against her head. She had then gone afterwards to seek medical help, which included a full assessment of her injuries, and clearly she had told the medical staff what had happened to her. And the judge said that an A&E nurse talking about the crimes against her and what she might do next had said to her, look, you know, if you do go and report this to the police, it might never come to court in the first place. And the judge really highlighting that as an illustration of just how difficult it is to try to get beyond this culture where people are scared to go to the authorities to report these crimes against them, and their feeling, of course, that they will not be taken seriously by the authorities and the courts. And in this particular case, of course, because he was a police officer and he made it clear to all of his victims that if they try to report him in any way, shape or form, that, they wouldn't be believed. He would be believed because he was a Metropolitan Police officer.
Yeah.
These are aggravating factors, Mark, and these will be taken into account by the judge when passing sentence. The very fact that he abused his position as a serving police officer in the most abhorrent manner to not just perpetrate the crimes, but to reiterate and hammer that home to his victims that they would not be believed, that he would be believed because he had the power and the status as a police officer. That is a very significant aggravating factor that will be considered by the judge when she passes her sentence.
Yeah, the judge just saying that he had a unique and defining office of a police constable and broad devastation caused to his victims, but saying he'd not expressed any remorse or regret for his prolific offending in what was an unrestrained campaign of rape against women. Clearly, this is an extensive summing up. We will obviously be back to you at Southwark for the sentence itself. But just one thought, Mark, before we move on. After the sentencing, what will happen in terms of the Met Police and their assessment of how his whole question has been addressed? I know, obviously, they've had this apology they've issued, but numerous occasions when perhaps his behaviour could have been picked up.
Yeah, it seems that we've been here so many times with the Metropolitan Police, with other police forces, to be fair, as well. It's a familiar picture, isn't it? The hand-wringing and the apologies and the promise that things will be different going forward. So the Metropolitan Police new Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, has said absolutely these corrupt officers need to be rooted out. He said very frankly, Mark, that there were a few hundred officers that he believed were in the Metropolitan Police who had no right to still be in that force. So let's take him at his word and let's see what happens within the Metropolitan Police going forward, whether these officers are being rooted out and are being kicked out of the job, because trust in the police really will rely on that. We've had too many of these cases in recent years, the most notable, of course, being Wayne Couzens, who went on to abduct, rape and murder Sarah Everard back in March of 2001. And incidentally, of course, Wayne Couzens served in that same Metropolitan Police unit, the Parliamentary and Diplomatic Protection Command, doing that same job as PC David Carrick here. But of course, the Wayne Couzens, of course, went on to kill his victim. But that aggravating factor of being a Metropolitan Police officer, of abusing the very considerable power he had as a police officer, was one of the reasons he got a whole life tariff. We're not expecting a whole life tariff for David Carrick, but we are, Mark, expecting a very significant sentence to be handed down.
Indeed. Mark, for the moment, thank you for that. Just to let you know, the judge has now finished going through the facts of the case and is now discussing the sentencing guidelines. So we'll return to Southwark as we get that sentence and more reaction from Mark. But let's move on to the other main news this afternoon, with Prime Minister Rishi Sunak having a cabinet reshuffle and a Whitehall shake-up at the same time. Let's take you through the changes. Former Trade Minister Greg Hands has now been appointed as the Conservative Party chairman to replace Nadhim Zahawi. The former Business Transport Secretary and now in a new department, Grant Shapps, it's energy security and net zero. So energy basically has been placed in its own remit now. And Kemi Badenoch, of course, one of the leadership contenders, now Secretary of State for Business and Trade. And then Lucy Fraser, who had been a housing minister, appointed as Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, and replacing Michelle Donnellan, who'd been in the role, now Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology. I think we're just going to return to Southwark Crown Court now for sentencing.
To the public and presently to yourself. I am sure the test is satisfied because of the persistence of your commission of serious sexual offences, particularly rapes, against so many victims over such a long period of time, which has already led to serious harm. I am sure that you present a grave danger to women who might be persuaded to be alone with you in intimate situations, and this danger will last indefinitely. I've considered guidance from Lord Thomas, the Chief Justice, in the Crown and Verinskas. I have to consider what form of sentence should follow this determination. Section 285 of the Sentencing Code applies to those offences you committed after the 4th of April 2005, which comprise the majority. I consider that the seriousness of the offences which I have to sentence you is such as to justify the imposition as a last resort of a sentence of imprisonment for life. Indeed, only such a sentence will meet the gravity of the offending I have to deal with you for, in combination with the risk you pose. Similarly, for the 5 offences of rape which fall out with the Sentencing Code scheme, I am satisfied that life sentences are required to meet the gravity of the offending and the risk you will continue to pose. I have assessed very carefully whether, given your abusive position, this case should attract a whole life order. The rare sentence of last resort is a life sentence with a whole life tariff. In the Crown and McCann, Sinaga and Shah 2020 EWCA Crim 1676, the Court of Appeal Criminal Division examined conjoined cases involving serious sexual offending on a scale of extreme gravity. Although life sentences with minimum terms to be served of 40 years were appropriate after a trial, none of those cases reached the threshold for a whole life tariff in the view of the court. None of those offenders was a policeman, and the court did not have drawn to their attention any potential scenario close to the one presented to this court. However, the prosecution specifically does not seek to persuade me that your offending fits the description of, quotes, wholly exceptional circumstances, which the court indicated would justify such an order. I've also scrutinised the judgment of the court in another recent conjoined case, the Crown and Stewart, Cousins, Tustin and Hughes, 2022 EWCA Crim 1063, in which the offender Cousins appealed against the whole life order imposed on him, following a notorious abduction of a young woman from the streets of London, accomplished while he was an off-duty police officer by use of his warrant card, followed by her rape and murder. The court accepted that police officers are in a uniquely powerful position. In respect of the fixing of minimum terms where a mandatory life sentence is required by law, as set out in Schedule 21 of the Sentencing Code, a different scheme to the one I have to apply. Lord Burnett, Chief Justice, stated the principle, quote, in our view, the correct approach is to focus on the facts, which in a rare case might lead to the conclusion that a whole life order is appropriate, close quote. At paragraph 83, having explained the correct route to a whole life order in that case, he continued, quote, this was, as the judge said, warped, selfish and brutal offending which was both sexual and homicidal. It was a case with unique and extreme aggravating features. Chief amongst these, as the judge correctly identified, was the grotesque misuse by Cousins of his position as a police officer with all that connoted to facilitate Miss Everard's kidnap, rape and murder. We agree with the observations of the judge about the unique position of the police, the critical importance of their role, and the critical trust the public repose in them." End of quote. Had the court in McCann imagined the facts of this case, would they have equated it to the gravity of the near-miss mass murder attempt or the foiled terrorist atrocity, which the court considered would compel a court to attach a whole life tariff to a discretionary life sentence? The standout feature is the element of abuse of the status of a police constable. But having considered the matter with care, I've come to the same conclusion as the prosecution. Of the utmost gravity though this is, the wholly exceptional circumstances test is not met. Thus, the imposition of a discretionary life sentence without a whole life tariff must be accompanied by an evaluation of the notional determinate term that would have been required to mark the gravity of the total offending had a life sentence not been imposed. That term provides the start of the calculation required to reach a minimum term an offender must serve. It must be for the shortest term that is commensurate with the seriousness of the offences before the court. Mr. Williamson, King's Counsel, in his succinct and well-focused mitigation, submits that the criminality before this court does not reach the extreme limits found in the cases of the offenders McCann and Sinaga. I do not agree. Your offending was over 17 years and encompassed 12 victims. Moreover, the singular element which elevates your offending as a brutal serial rapist into that company is the principal aggravating feature of the explicit or implicit use of your occupation to entice, reassure, or intimidate your victims. You have to bear in mind that my function is to impose appropriate punishment, and when that is served, the parole board will decide how to protect the public thereafter. Decades will have passed before that time comes. I conclude that the notional determinate sentence that would provide a just and proportionate punishment is 60 years. To that guilty plea, a discount of 20% will be applied. It is to your credit that you did not contest a trial. Your decision deserves this recognition because there is no doubt that a court hearing at which evidence is given and challenged provides a particular ordeal for victims. From the resulting term of 48 years, I have to set 2/3 minus the time spent so far in custody, which is 491 days. Stand up, David Carrick. I've made ancillary orders for deprivation pursuant to Section 153 of the Sentencing Act 2020 and restraining orders under Sections 359 and 360 of the Act. They will remain in force until further order. The victim surcharge applies. I make no sexual harm prevention orders given the nature of the sentence I am about to pass. On the main indictment on counts 16, 19, 29, 30, 31, 32, 38, 39, 42 and 43, the sentence is 4 years imprisonment on each concurrent. On counts 24 and 25, the sentence is 7 years on each concurrent. On count 6, on the second indictment, I impose a concurrent determinate sentence of 9 years. 31 sentences of life imprisonment are imposed on the main indictment on counts 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 17, 18, 20, 21, 22, 23, 26, 27, 28, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 40 and 41. Also, 5 life sentences are imposed on the second indictment on counts 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. This makes a total of 36 life sentences. The minimum term you will have to serve before the parole board can think of releasing you is 30 years, 239 days. And you may go down.
So that is the sentence that's been passed on David Carrick. Just to remind you what the judge was explaining there, in total 36 life sentences for his offending, in particular, as she said, the brutal serial rapes, a total of 60 years. That was reduced by a 20% discount, she said, because he had pleaded guilty. And then bearing in mind the minimum term that he will serve, that will be 30 years, 239 days. Now, we also have to tell you that the judge had indicated that Carrick had tried to take his life while in prison, that he was removed from Belmarsh Prison to Rampton Psychiatric Hospital after that attempt to take his own life. The judge telling Southwark Crown Court that prison authorities feared he was suffering from severe depression, but the judge saying that the result was, after being analysed, it was a self-pitying reaction, she said, of shame brought on by these proceedings rather than any remorse. So found not to be suffering from any mental disorder. So just to reiterate, the total that we have is 48 years for some 36 life sentences imposed for his offences, with an order that he serves a minimum of 30 years, 239 days. Let's get more with Mark White, who's outside Southwark Crown Court. As you were saying, Mark, no indication of the whole life tariff, and the judge explained why it didn't meet those tests. But bearing in mind his age, he will be spending most of the rest of his life behind bars.
Yes, it's that minimum tariff that is the crucial part of that sentence here, the time that he will have to spend in jail before he can be even considered as eligible for parole. So 30, just over 30 years he will have to remain in prison before there's any prospect that he could be released. And as a man of 48, he's going to be almost 80 years of age before he is ever considered for release. So perfectly possible he may spend the rest of his life behind bars. I should just tell you that there is a disturbance happening outside the front of Southwark Crown Court. Not all that uncommon. Sometimes these things happen outside Crown Courts, but today of all days there have been protests here. But it appears to be a man who's trying to bash his way into the front door of the court. We're not sure if it's related to this ongoing case, but as I say, that very crucial minimum sentence, it was passed down more than 30 years for this former police officer who abused his position in the most appalling manner to try to cajole people in the first place, to go back to his home or hotels in some instances, and then, of course, to use his position as a police officer to coerce and to bully and intimidate these people into doing what he wanted and warn them off the prospect that or warn them off from trying to tell the authorities, because he was a member of the authorities. As I say, there are some difficult questions for the Metropolitan Police in this case as well to answer, because we know that there were 9 separate occasions where his offending behaviour came to authorities at the Metropolitan Police and were not properly acted on, or not acted on at all. And the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, has said that is certainly a matter for regret, and that the force is determined to make these vital improvements going forward. But I've been taking a look back at this case, at this serial rapist, this former police officer, and those very difficult questions that Scotland Yard now has to answer. As a Metropolitan Police officer, PC David Carrick was supposed to protect the public. Instead, he preyed on them, using his status as an armed officer to trick, control and silence his victims. A serial offender, he admitted to a staggering total of almost 50 offences, including 24 separate counts of rape. At Scotland Yard, the force may be under new management, but it is an all too familiar picture. A humiliating act of public contrition amid promises that the Met is focused on cleaning up its act.
We haven't applied the same sense of ruthlessness to guarding our own integrity that we routinely apply to confronting criminals, and I'm deeply sorry for that.
PC Carrick worked as a firearms officer in the Parliamentary and Diplomatic Protection Command, whose officers guard key buildings like Parliament, embassies and Downing Street. It's the unit where PC Wayne Couzens, another corrupt officer, served. He went on to kidnap, rape and murder marketing executive Sarah Everard in March 2021. The court heard how PC Carrick repeatedly humiliated his victims, locking some women in the understairs cupboard at his home here in Stevenage, or forcing them to clean his house naked, referring to his victims as slaves and telling them when they could eat and sleep. His crimes went undetected by the force he worked for, despite his behaviour being brought to the attention of senior officers on 9 separate occasions. In 2000, Carrick was accused of burglary and sending abusive messages, but the next year he passed the vetting procedures to join the Metropolitan Police. While serving, he was first accused of harassment and assault in 2002. He came to their attention again 2 years later after an alleged domestic incident. Despite a string of other allegations, none of them proven, he passed fresh vetting checks in 2017. In July 2021, he was placed on restricted duties after being arrested on suspicion of rape. But 2 months later, those restrictions were lifted after the charges were dropped. It was only in October that year that Carrick was finally suspended after prosecutors charged him following another allegation of rape at this hotel in St Albans by a woman he'd met on a dating app.
An absolute shocking case, this one.
Policing analyst Graham Wetton said this appalling breach of trust underlines the urgent need to change the standards and the culture within the UK's biggest police force.
This was a dreadful case, and it has to be a priority for the new Commissioner and the management team to address the issues with the Met, restore trust and confidence by looking at any offending that's gone on and root these people out of policing.
PC David Carrick's crimes have had a devastating impact on the lives of his victims. But the failure of his commanding officers to act far sooner has destroyed the trust of many others within the wider community. Mark White, GB News at Scotland Yard.
Let's return to Mark now. Mark, we have to warn people, as you're saying, there's quite a lot of disturbance there outside Southwark Crown Court at the moment. But let's reflect the judge indicating that Carrick had attempted to kill himself on remand in Belmarsh and then detained at a secure hospital, found not to be suffering from mental disorder, said Mrs Justice Chima Grubb. Driven to try to commit suicide as a self-pitying reaction, she said. But clearly now the question as to where he will be incarcerated, given this position as a former police officer.
Yes, there will have to be an assessment of his mental health state going forward as to whether there is any potential for him to try to do that and take his own life again. This was in July of last year while he was being held at Belmarsh Prison. According to the judge, he tried to kill himself using a razor blade. So he was taken to Rampton Psychiatric Unit where he has been for a number of months undergoing assessment and treatment. And as I say, that assessment will be ongoing because clearly if there is any potential for this former police officer to cause himself harm, then that will have to be taken into consideration. But yes, you are right in also highlighting that as a former police officer, it will be difficult for him in prison, no matter what his mental health, because he was a police officer, and of course also someone convicted of the most appalling sexual acts. And we know that in prison those convicted of sexual offences don't have an easy time of it. Former police officers certainly don't have an easy time of it, and the judge alluded to that in her remarks, saying that he will have many difficult years ahead of him in prison, clearly as a former police officer and in light of the offences that he admitted to. Going forward, Mark, we have this former police officer out of the force and now in jail. But we have, according to the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, fairly new in post, hundreds of others that he believes should not be serving still within the Metropolitan Police, people that have been or are subject to disciplinary proceedings. So going forward, it will certainly be of note to find out what Sir Mark Rowley is planning to do with regard to those who are still within that police service. We are not, we're told, we're not expecting anything from the Metropolitan Police today. We might get something from the Hertfordshire Police, the local police force in the area where David Carrick lived, up in Hertfordshire. They may be making a statement at some point today. The Crown Prosecution Service may also make a statement at some point. We know that some of the victims have been in court, have been at Scotland Yard listening to proceedings as well.
Yeah.
We're not expecting any public comment from them for obvious reasons, but representatives of some of those women, I'm sure, will be making their views known to us at some point.
Indeed, and of course one reflects on his former colleagues who will be thinking about maybe whether they should have said or done more at the time. Mark, back to you, of course, as perhaps we hear from Crown Prosecution Service and the lawyers involved. But for the moment, thank you very much indeed for that. So just to reiterate what's happened at Southwark Crown Court, Carrick has been given 36 life sentences for his 85 offences against 12 women over a period of 17 years. So the sentence worked out at 60 years from the judge, but then with a discounted 20% for pleading guilty, and a minimum term of 30 years and 239 days. And bearing in mind, of course, that Carrick is aged 48, he will spend most of the rest of his life behind bars. More reaction from Southwark as we get it. But let's reflect now on what's been going on at Downing Street and Westminster with a reshuffle and a reorganisation. Just to take you through the details once more, the former Trade Minister Greg Hands appointed as the new Conservative Party chairman to replace Nadeem Zahawi. Former Business and Transport Secretary then Grant Shapps has got a new department. It's Energy Security and Net Zero, so now a new standalone department. While the contender for the party leadership in the summer had been International Trade Secretary Kemi Badenoch, now Secretary of State for Business and Trade. Then Lucy Fraser, a Housing Minister, now appointed as Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, replacing Michelle Donnellan, who goes over to being Secretary of State there for Science, Innovation and Technology. Well, let's get more now with Darren McCaffrey, who's been looking at not just the change in personnel, but the change in structure, in particular this issue of putting energy standalone for energy security and net zero.
Yeah, I think first of all, Mark, we should reflect on the fact that this has seemed to have happened thus far pretty smoothly. It was unexpected in the sense that I don't think anyone this week was expecting a reshuffle, even a small one, to take place. It clearly broke late last night. It clearly only involved a small number of people really in Downing Street who were aware of all of this. But as I say, and these things can be complicated, it does seem to have gone relatively smoothly, though talking to one senior MP on my way here, he said, don't mention the Titanic and moving deck chairs. But let's look at some of the detail, as you've gone through there, of the changing of departments. I mean, first of all, this creation of the Energy Security and Net Zero Department, I think welcomed across the board in terms of energy security, not least of all because there is a sense that Britain needs to get on top of energy security given what's happened over the last year or so, and that plan to build more nuclear power stations and indeed wind and solar energy in the years to come. Also, though, what's interesting is that title also includes net zero. And it's maybe a signal that the Prime Minister is still determined to keep that commitment of getting Britain down to net zero by the middle of this century, much to the angst, it must be said, of some within his own party. Also interesting, Kevin Badenoch has got an expanded department now. She's in charge of both trade and business. So that's quite a big bump up, if you would like, in regards to her responsibilities within the Cabinet. I'm sure she'll be pretty pleased with that. Michelle Donnellan's going to science, innovation and technology. Again, something that Rishi Sunak repeatedly during the summer said he was committed to, wanting to make the UK a science superpower. Many saying he wants to make it a bit more like Silicon Valley, which I'm sure he wouldn't disagree with, and clearly that is the role that Michelle Donnellan will have to fulfil. And then Lucy Fraser in Culture, Media and Sport, which doesn't seem to have changed as a department very much. Interesting though, she was a housing minister, and many people again complaining that in a department we're on to, I think, a sixth housing minister in the space of a year, that there is no consistency there when it comes to a really important public policy area. And also questions about what this does achieve, Mark, in the long term, in that it's going to take, at least 6 months for these departments to properly get set up, to have HR departments, to have email addresses, permanent secretaries. Is that really going to change things ahead of a general election in just over a year's time? Then let's just focus on that finally with Greg Hands, who, no pun intended, is viewed as a safe pair of hands, a former trade minister himself, who now takes over from Nadeem Zahawi as Conservative Party chairman, seen as a good campaigner, which frankly the Conservative Party need at the moment, given where they are in the polls. But also it's a big job. It's been essentially the CEO, the chief executive, if you like, of the Conservative Party. One of the big areas that they need is money. Donations have not been keeping up with speed with the Labour Party, for example, with the Conservatives recently. So he is going to have a pretty big job on his hands. I'll stop it with there.
Indeed, yeah. And there may be some applause behind you. I don't know. No, he's still got his placard. Anyway, thank you for trying to raise the tone. Just to update you, actually, Downing Street in the last few minutes, saying that plans for the shake-up had been worked on for some time, but as Darren was indicating, there will not be a silver bullet to address all the problems faced by the country. More from Darren a little later. But let's reflect now on the ongoing search for the missing mother, Nicola Bulley, continuing today after a fresh appeal by her partner, who said that their two daughters desperately missed her and needed her back. Well, the search now entering its 11th day after Nicola went missing on January the 27th at St Michael's and Wyre in Lancashire. Let's get the latest now with our North West of England reporter, Sophie Reaper, who's been following the story. And Sophie, I think we've still got this sonar search going on, but they're going back upstream, away from that bench where she was last seen.
That is indeed the case, Mark. Yes, yesterday, SGI, the independent search team, joined Lancashire Police in trying to find the missing mother of two, Nicola Bulley. So just to clarify, this river is separated into two parts. There's the part that's tidal, which is where they were checking yesterday, and then there's the part which is, you can see behind me, which is non-tidal. So that means it's not affected by the tide. That's where they're checking today. You mentioned the bench there where police believe Nicola may have gone missing from. That's just to my left here. Today, the SGI have been using that sonar equipment to search in this area of the river, and since around 10 o'clock this morning, the boat has been making laps around this section of the river, obviously trying to find some answers. Of course, the people most desperate for those answers are Nicola's friends and family. A little bit earlier on, I spoke with one of Nicola's friends, Jill Peck. This is what she had to say.
I mean, there are no words, really. It's one of the situations throughout life you don't want to have to live through. And we are so grateful to the SGI team and obviously the police who are working closely with them and the community and just working tirelessly really to try and find out what's happened to Nikki. Yeah, it's an emotional roller coaster for sure. We need to keep, more than ever, as a family and as friends, we're keeping hope. We're trying our best to stay positive. We want to bring Nikki home. Her two little girls need her. They're desperate for her back, to cuddle them in at night. And obviously, just we just need some answers. We need factual facts. We need evidence. Anyone that's out there that feels they may have dashcam footage, there's a section of road that we're missing, Garstang Road towards St Michael's, and we just need some answers.
And so,
well, the search does continue for the 45-year-old, and as we just heard there, until they do get answers, Nicola's friends and family are going to continue to have hope that they will find the mother of two.
And Sophie, just to indicate what the team is saying about the length of time now just to search this extra section upstream.
Sorry, Mark, I just lost you there. I think you asked me about the length of time that they're spending upstream.
Yeah.
If that is indeed the case, as I say, they began at around 10 o'clock this morning. They seem to spend a relatively short amount of time just upstream, but when they reach this section here where the bench is, they've spent around 2 hours going back and forth. It seems they're almost taking it in laps, going around the width of the river itself, just looking for any signs of Nicola Bulley.
Sophie, thank you very much indeed for that. Back to you, of course, as that operation continues throughout the afternoon. Thanks very much indeed. Now, let's reflect on the aftermath of the earthquake in Turkey and Syria, with a 3-month state of emergency being announced. The latest details: a huge fire at the port of Iskenderun has started. Containers had toppled over because of the quakes, and that's ignited this fire in the thick, black, acrid smoke. And I'm afraid the number of dead continuing to rise across the country. The World Health Organization fearing it could reach a figure of some 20,000. Many still trapped under the rubble after the first 7.8 quake hitting yesterday, followed by another 7.5 earthquake, and indeed a third tremor this morning, measuring at 5.7 on the scale. That's affected all the sort of rescue efforts. And we're being told by all the agencies involved that we've got extreme cold, particularly in northern Syria, so that all those who've survived have got additional problems. The official death toll at the moment, more than 5,000. But as we say, the World Health Organization fearing that could rise to more than 20,000. Some 6,000 buildings have been destroyed or collapsed. So we'll update you. This is the latest from northern Syria, and a boy being pulled from the rubble. So there are still wonderful stories of people being rescued in these extremely difficult conditions, which is giving hope to the rescue teams. The UK, of course, sending its own team. Wonderful to see that people are still being saved from the rubble in these pictures. And just to reiterate, in Syria, the UK-funded White Helmets Group is helping with those operations there. 76 people from the UK leaving from Birmingham Airport with 4 sniffer dogs, part of the specialist teams that Andrew Mitchell, the Development Minister, outlined. We'll update you, of course, as they arrive in Turkey and northern Syria. Now, to other matters. Tonight, Wrexham go up against Sheffield United in their 4th round FA Cup replay, and then a tie against Spurs up for grabs. Well, it marks 2 years since the actors Ryan Reynolds and Rob Mahelny bought the club. In that time, Wrexham gaining city status, as well as being the stars of their own documentary. Our reporter, Jack Carson, has more on this.
It's almost 2 years since 2 stars of Hollywood bought one Welsh football club. Now Wrexham are facing the prospect of playing Premier League Tottenham Hotspur if they can beat Sheffield United in tonight's FA Cup replay. As well as huge investment and improvement on the pitch, off it, the partnership of Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney is putting Wrexham firmly back on the map. I met up with Wrexham AFC superfan Kevin Jones, who describes the change in the atmosphere around the city.
Well, we're getting 10,000 fans a week. We're taking 4,500 to Coventry, like this Tuesday, 5,000 fans going to Sheffield United. It's just bringing more and more support to the club. Now the kids, it's all Wrexham, 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 and it's the town's just buzzing. It's absolutely buzzing. Like the impact on, financially for the old town, it's starting to brighten up a little bit. So we do need more shops coming in and things like that, which hopefully it does.
But more support can also cause more issues. This McDonald's in the town centre behind me has started playing classical music on a match day to try and calm down fans. Away from the football, global exposure has proved good for business. billion-pound property firm FI Real Estate Management have increased their investment into the area since the football club was taken over.
What they've done is just supercharged the entire area, and it's been a real, good look factor, a good feel factor. And if you look at what the local authorities doing by way of regeneration and the rest of it, of course it made us just, want to buy more land. We bought 46 acres. We've actually just recently bought another 47 acres. So we've got huge plans there. And if you look at the plans we've got, it's 1,800,000 square feet of new build. That effectively is another £140 million worth of investment on top of what we've already invested.
Looking forward, local MP Sarah Atherton hopes to win financial support for the city from round 3 of the government's Levelling Up Fund.
We unfortunately did not get it this time round. I'm a little miffed with the government for not doing that, because Wrexham really needs this bid. We need to level up sport in North Wales. The Gateway bid is more than just a stadium. It's about the whole entry into Wrexham. We need to get that over the line. We need to get that built so people, when they come into Wrexham, can see that we are optimistic, we're aspiring, we're going forth, we're looking forward whilst holding on to our heritage and our background. But, we're Wrexham and we're here to stay.
Hollywood seems to have secured Wrexham's stability for years to come. But tonight, their ticket to an FA Cup 5th round tie against Spurs still needs to be secured. Lights, camera, action Wrexham. Jack Carson, GB News.
And we'll follow that story, of course, and see what emerges. But let's just remind you of the breaking news we brought you this hour from Southwark Crown Court, and that is the sentencing of the former Metropolitan Police policeman David Carrick. That's the scene outside Southwark Crown Court. We may get more from the lawyers, but just to remind you that he has been sentenced to 36 separate life sentences for 85 offences against 12 women over a period of 17 years. The full sentence was 60 years, reduced by 20% for his guilty plea to 48, and then with a minimum term of 30 years, 239 days. Well, you've been giving us your reaction to this. First of all, Alan, 30 years not enough, should be whole life not to see the light of day. Brian says that equates to 1 year for each life sentence, simply not enough. Sharon, meanwhile, that sentence isn't even a year for each sex attack or rape. It's a disgrace. Keep your views coming, and of course we'll update you with more from Southwark Crown Court. We'll be back at the top of the hour. Stay with us from GB News Live.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi, Andrew Pierce here. Join me every Friday lunchtime for a proper no-nonsense debrief of the week's events. With special guests in the studio and the GB News team on the ground, I'll be getting you up to date with news, some intelligent discussion and my own sharp take. The weekend starts here with me every Friday lunchtime on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview channel 236
and YouView channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio
with the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's 1 o'clock and you're watching GB News Live with me, Mark Longhurst. Coming up for you this hour, former Met Police officer David Carrick, who'd admitted sexual offences against women, including dozens of rapes, is sentenced to 36 separate life sentences and a minimum term of 30 years and 239 days behind bars. The judge said he'd subjected his dozen victims to violent and brutal sexual offences when under the influence of alcohol, turning into a monster. We'll have more live from Southwark Crown Court, as well as a reaction of a police officer who'd abused his position. All change, Rishi Sunak reshuffling his cabinet and reorganising Whitehall departments. Tory favourite Kemi Badenoch now leading a new business and trade department. Meanwhile, the wait for a new Conservative Party chairman, well, it's over because step forward Westminster veteran Greg Hands, said to be a safe pair of hands. While in other news, Grant Shapps heads up a new standalone energy department also to cover net zero. Michelle Donnellan inheriting a science and innovation technology department. We'll have all the latest reaction and the views of David Cameron's former chief of staff. Britain sending more search and rescue specialists and dog teams to Turkey as the official death toll rises above 5,000. The World Health Organization saying or warning that could be rising to 20,000 victims. We'll have the latest on the tragedy. Also here, nurses out on strike for a second day. Have you had an operation or a procedure cancelled as a result? Email us what your experience is, gbviews@gbnews.uk. But let's get the latest headlines now with Tamsin.
Mark, thank you. Good afternoon from the GB newsroom. It's 2 minutes past 1. Former Met Police officer David Carrick has been handed 36 life sentences for sexual offences against a dozen women. The 48-year-old pleaded guilty to 49 charges, including 24 counts of rape, all carried out while he was serving in the force. He will have to serve a minimum of 30 years behind bars. Mrs Justice Chima Grubb referred to what she called a spectacular downfall for a man charged with upholding the law, telling Carrick he'd lost his liberty, job and status. Rishi Sunak has revealed his new cabinet following a reshuffle this morning, whilst creating 4 new departments. Greg Hands takes over as the new Conservative Party chairman after Nadeem Sahawi was sacked. The business, trade and culture departments have been broken down into separate units, with Grant Shapps now Secretary of State for a new energy security and net zero department aimed at securing long-term energy and supply and bringing down bills. Kemi Badenoch is the new Secretary of State for Business and Trade. Lucy Fraser has become the Culture Secretary, taking over from Michelle Donnellan, who's been made a new Science and Technology Secretary. Turkey's President Erdogan has declared a state of emergency for 3 months in the 10 cities impacted by the earthquakes. It's after eastern Turkey was struck by a third earthquake this morning, measuring 5.7 on the Richter scale. The number of people killed across the country and Syria has risen to more than 5,000. The first 7.8 magnitude quake hit in the early hours of yesterday morning, with a second major earthquake measuring 7.5 just a few hours later. Almost 6,000 buildings have been destroyed in the tremor and aftershocks. Rescuers continue to dig through rubble in search of survivors. Journalists...
Adana, this city is one of the most affected ones. It's one of the 10 most affected cities in Turkey. Right now, if you can see behind me, right a second ago, they actually found someone. The teams here that just managed to get someone out. And they're just taking him to the ambulance.
That was journalist Iona Sakufakis talking to us there from the Turkish town of Adana. Surrey police have confirmed the deaths of Epsom College head teacher Emma Pattinson and her daughter Letty are being treated as a murder investigation. The two bodies were found, along with Emma's husband George, in the grounds of the school in the early hours of Sunday. The force have said George Patterson had recently been in contact with the police about his shotgun licence in order to change his address to the site of the school. An underwater search for missing mother Nicola Bulley is still underway in the River Wyre. It's been 11 days since Miss Bulley went missing after taking her dog for a walk in St Michael's on Wyre in Lancashire. The search follows a fresh appeal by her partner, who said her two daughters desperately miss her and need her back. Forensic search specialist Peter Folding says they need to rule everything out.
Somebody could have put the phone on the bench. Somebody could have found it and put it on the bench, just on the nearest bench. We don't know. Nobody knows. This is a complete mystery, this whole thing. And normally, if somebody falls in the water, if Nicola went in here, her body would have gone straight to the bottom. It would remain there, and police divers would have found her that day.
The BBC chairman has denied giving Boris Johnson financial advice before getting the job at the broadcaster, calling their relationship broadly professional. Richard Sharp has appeared for questioning before a cross-panel party of MPs this morning. It's after it was revealed he was involved in helping secure Mr Johnson a loan of up to £800,000 before the then Prime Minister backed his appointment to the role at the BBC. His selection is also under investigation. Shadow Climate Secretary Ed Miliband is calling on the government to bring forward a proper windfall tax on energy companies after BP announced its biggest yearly profit in history. The energy giant has more than doubled its earnings from the year before, earning £23 billion in profits in 2022 after energy prices surged due to the war in Ukraine. BP Chief Executive Bernard Looney says stronger plant reliability and a lower cost of production helped with profits. The Shadow Defence Secretary is to argue that cuts to the British Army must be stopped to show the UK is a leading European member in NATO. In a speech at the Royal United Services Institute today, John Healey will outline Labour's plans to ensure the UK's duty to the alliance are fulfilled in full. It follows Defence Secretary Ben Wallace conceding the armed forces had been hollowed out and underfunded. This is GB News. More headlines from me shortly. Now, though, it's back to Mark.
Thank you very much, Tamsin. So, former Metropolitan Police Officer David Carrick has been taken down to the cells at Southwark Crown Court after being sentenced to 36 separate life sentences. It means he will serve a minimum of 30 years and 239 days for a total of 85 offences against a dozen women over a 17-year period. Well, the 48-year-old pleaded guilty to the offences, including those 24 counts of rape, all carried out while he was actually serving in the force. The judge, Mrs Justice Chima Grubb, told him it was a spectacular downfall for a man charged with upholding the law and that he had lost his liberty, his job and his status. Let's get more with our Home Security editor, Mark White, who's been following the case at Southwark Crown Court. And Mark, obviously we heard the judge explaining why it was not a whole life sentence, but clearly he will be spending most of the rest of his natural life now behind bars.
Yes, it's that sort of tricky act that judges always have in trying to weigh up what the sentence should be, and clearly it's not necessarily satisfactory to all of those, including maybe his victims, but it is a very significant jail term, more than 30 years that he will have to spend behind bars before he's then even considered for parole at that point. And of course he will be almost 80 years of age by that time, if indeed he lives that long. Now, there's a few things that I need to tell you about. We're expecting in the next few minutes, we're told, the Chief Constable of Hertfordshire Police, Charlie Hall, to come out here to the steps of Southwark Crown Court. Hertfordshire was, of course, the investigating force that carried out the investigations into all of the allegations made against David Carrick and brought this prosecution to the court. So Charlie Hall coming out to give his remarks following this conviction of former police officer David Carrick. And we're also now told, having been told by Scotland Yard, that there would be no formal comment from them today, at least on camera. We're told now that we can expect the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, to make remarks at Scotland Yard at some point in the next hour or two this afternoon. So both of these statements we're hoping to bring to you. And we've also had a statement just in from the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, commenting on the sentence handed down today. As Suella Braverman says, the crimes of David Carrick are a scar on our police, and it's only right that he now faces at least 30 years behind bars. I pay tribute, she says, to the brave women who've come forward to hold him to account for his vile abuse. She also says it is vital that we uncover how he was able to wear the uniform for so long. And I welcome the Angiolini inquiry's investigation into David Carrick's criminal behaviour and the decision-making around his vetting. And finally, she says, there is no place in our police for such heinous and predatory behaviour. And of course, going forward, we will await to see what Scotland Yard, indeed policing right across the country, is doing to root out those corrupt officers. So Mark Rowley alluded to this in an interview that he gave just in recent days, where he said that he believed there were hundreds of police officers still in the job within his force, within the Metropolitan Police, who should never be there in the first place. So, as I say, it will be interesting to see what he does in the weeks and months ahead. I've been looking back at this case, at the case of a Metropolitan Police officer who abused his power in the most appalling manner. As a Metropolitan Police officer, PC David Carrick was supposed to protect the public. Instead, he preyed on them, using his status as an armed officer to trick, control and silence his victims. A serial offender, he admitted to a staggering total of almost 50 offences, including 24 separate counts of rape. At Scotland Yard, the force may be under new management, but it is an all too familiar picture. A humiliating act of public contrition amid promises that the Met is focused on cleaning up its act.
We haven't applied the same sense of ruthlessness to guarding our own integrity that we routinely apply to confronting criminals, and I'm deeply sorry for that.
PC Carrick worked as a firearms officer in the Parliamentary and Diplomatic Protection Command, whose officers guard key buildings like Parliament, embassies and Downing Street. It's the unit where PC Wayne Couzens, another corrupt officer, served. He went on to kidnap, rape and murder marketing executive Sarah Everard in March 2021. The court heard how PC Carrick repeatedly humiliated his victims, locking some women in the understairs cupboard at his home here in Stevenage, or forcing them to clean his house naked, referring to his victims as slaves and telling them when they could eat and sleep. His crimes went undetected by the force he worked for, despite his behaviour being brought to the attention of senior officers on 9 separate occasions. In 2000, Carrick was accused of burglary and sending abusive messages, but the next year he passed the vetting procedures to join the Metropolitan Police. While serving, he was first accused of harassment and assault in 2002. He came to their attention again 2 years later after an alleged domestic incident. Despite a string of other allegations, none of them proven, he passed fresh vetting checks in 2017. In July 2021, he was placed on restricted duties after being arrested on suspicion of rape. But 2 months later, those restrictions were lifted after the charges were dropped. It was only in October that year that Carrick was finally suspended after prosecutors charged him following another allegation of rape at this hotel in St Albans by a woman he'd met on a dating app.
An absolute shocking case, this one.
Policing analyst Graham Wetton said this appalling breach of trust underlines the urgent need to change the standards and the culture within the UK's biggest police force.
This was a dreadful case, and it has to be a priority for the new commissioner and the management team to address the issues with the Met, restore trust and confidence by looking at any offending that's gone on and root these people out of policing.
PC David Carrick's crimes have had a devastating impact on the lives of his victims. But the failure of his commanding officers to act far sooner has destroyed the trust of many others within the wider community. Mark White, GB News at Scotland Yard.
Well, let's just update you on exactly what he was charged with, because obviously you may be confused about the numbers that have been reported. Just to explain that Carrick had previously pleaded guilty to 49 charges, including 24 counts of rape. But because somewhat what they call multiple incident counts, the court was dealing with at least 85 separate offences, including at least 71 sexual offences and 48 rapes, which explains why, obviously, the judge, Mrs Justice Chima Grubb, was taking so much time in her summing up. Well, let's get some reaction now, and the women's rights activist Patsy Stevenson is joining us with her reaction. Patsy, thank you very much indeed for joining us on GB News. I know difficult for many to actually countenance the scale of what the court has heard. I think a lot of women's charities saying, well, yes, it's good that justice has been done, but it's a bit late in the day.
Yeah, I mean, like we've been saying for years, the police are corrupt. And without issuing anything, without doing anything, without consequences, this is what happens. So people aren't even shocked at the moment that this has happened. It's disgusting. It's absolutely disgusting. And I know a lot of women are so exhausted by this now.
We are expecting Sir Mark Rowley from Scotland Yard to make some comments this afternoon. And then Hertfordshire Police, Charlie Hall, their Chief Constable who investigated Carrick, will be speaking outside the court. What do you want to hear from them?
I mean, anything we hear at this point, we've already heard before. I want to see action. I don't want to hear anything more. I just want to see them change things.
And what do you make of the judge's comments on the courage of the 12 victims who came forward? Because clearly without their evidence, it's unlikely that Carrick would have actually acknowledged his crimes without all the details being put forward.
Well, that's the thing. You know, I can't imagine how much courage it takes to come forward with stuff like this, especially against someone who's in the police force. So, you know, that's tremendous courage. And I can't believe what they've been through. I think what we really need to get down to the point is, though, that women need to be believed more, because they probably came out about this many times and weren't believed, even to friends and family. We need to start believing women when they come out about this stuff. When, like, a lot of men counteract it and say, well, what about false accusations? You're more likely to be hit by a comet than you are to be falsely accused of rape by a woman. So we need to scrap that argument completely and start believing women.
So a cultural change, in other words, not just the detail of procedure as such.
Yeah, completely. I mean, misogyny is rife within our society. We see things like Andrew Tate, and at the moment, there's several women in the news. These are just the ones that have been spoken about that have been murdered or raped or something, and they're just the ones that are on the TV. There's so many others that are currently in them situations, and nothing is being done about it. It just feels like the end of the world. It's ridiculous.
Because they're not being believed.
Not just because they're not being believed, but also the onus is on men because of the way that men not all men, but men are being towards women. And the difficulty is that a lot of people think that it's some horror movie character down a dark alley. It's not. It's your best mate. Your best mate down the pub. If he's joking about abuse, he may be doing it. You need to call it out and challenge it and see what he's actually up to.
Patsy, thank you very much indeed for bringing us your reaction to this sentencing today. Well, let's speak now to another woman, Dr. Margaret Hefferman, because she's a senior management professor at Bath University and actually advised the Casey Review into culture and standards and the behaviour of the Met after the rape and murder of Sarah Everard. And, of course, we heard that referred to in the sentencing or the summing up by the judge, Dr. Hefferman. What do you make of the fact that this was, as the various charities have observed, a 17-year period that went unchallenged?
Well, I think what it says very clearly is that this was a systemic problem. It's not just a one-off. And I think that when you're talking about systemic problems, it's very easy to make it sound as if, well, then it's kind of nobody's problem. I think really, you know, the truth here is exactly as your previous speaker has said. We have known that the police in London are corrupt for a very long time, and we've done very little about it. And my big hope here is that the huge amount of time, effort and money that has been spent on the Casey report and the huge diligence that Dame Louise Casey has applied towards this very knotty problem, I hope that it won't, like other reports, be buried. I hope that it won't, get a week's publicity and then nobody does anything about it and it's forgotten about. And I hope that one of the things that's deeply understood is that problems like this persist, not just because they're bad guys, but because there are plenty of people around them who feel there's something a bit off, there's something a bit wrong, a bit uncomfortable, but they don't say anything because their loyalty to the institution means they feel they mustn't rat out their mates. Well, the reluctance to rat out their mate in this case has ratted out the reputation of the Metropolitan Police and every single person serving in it. So this needs now to be taken personally.
Dr. Heffernan, apologies
to improve that reputation.
I'm just going to interrupt you because we have got a police news conference now underway. They're giving their reaction. Thank you for your time. This is down at
David Carrick has been handed life sentences today. I'm truly humbled by the bravery of the victims. Each one was prepared to live their horrendous ordeal and face Carrick in court. I would also like to thank the Crown Prosecution team at Thames Chiltern. We've worked side by side with the exceptional team of lawyers since October 2021, building a strong and compelling case. Our investigation does not stop here, however, and we've set up a special reporting portal to allow people to continue to share information with us. This portal will remain open and details can be found on the Hertfordshire Police website. I would urge anyone who thinks they've been a victim of David Carrick to come forward. We still want to hear from you and we will support you. As a serving police officer, David Carrick has brought shame on the profession and was not fit to wear the uniform. But I hope that our determination to get justice for the victims in this case will go some way to reassuring the public that nobody is above the law and we will bring people like David Carrick to justice.
Today's vote recognising the outstanding bravery of the victims. It often takes courage for anyone to come forward and report a rape, but in this case, to overcome the mental and physical oppression they endured may have felt insurmountable at times. We've heard the accounts of women who suffered at Carrick's hands. He took away their control, their right to choose, their freedom, in some cases both physically and mentally. We cannot undo the pain and anguish that they have endured, but I hope that they can take this first step in rebuilding their lives knowing that he can't harm them or any other woman. We are so grateful to every woman who has come forward and supported this case. With each report that came in, we had a clearer picture of who Carrick was and what he had done. The similarities between the victim accounts detailing mental and physical torment at the hands of the same man were our case. We would not be where we are today without you, the victims, taking that step forward and providing us with the vital evidence needed to prosecute Carrick. With your help, the Crown Prosecution Service worked with the investigation team at Hertfordshire Constabulary to build such a strong case that Carrick had no choice but to plead guilty. We know there are victims of other rape and serious sexual offences out there, and that many of you may be worried about being believed or whether you will ever see justice done. We understand these concerns and want to reassure you that we are doing everything that we can to improve how these offences are handled, and we are determined to see justice done for more victims of violence against women and girls. We hope seeing Carrick, a prolific abuser, manipulator and rapist, behind bars will encourage other women to come forward, knowing we will do all we can to hold the person responsible to account for their crime. Thank you.
A short statement there at Southwark Crown Court from Hertfordshire Police. Just to remind you, the police force investigating Carrick, and just to reiterate, they say that Carrick had brought shame on the profession, not fit to wear the uniform, but adding that investigations into his conduct will continue. And we were hearing there that the Hertfordshire Police website is still open for anyone that wants to actually get in contact. Police saying that we still want to hear from you. Let's speak now to Mark White, our Home Security Editor, who's following these sentencing events down at Southwark Crown Court. Interesting there, Mark. We're getting the message, really, that this may not be over. They still want to hear from people.
No, and for good reason, because this was a case that throughout, as almost every month that passed, more of David Carrick's victims were coming forward. I was at the original Magistrates Court hearing when David Carrick appeared back in 2021, and then it was one count of rape that he faced against one individual. But of course, as time went on and his name was then, because he'd been charged, his name was then in the public sphere, other victims clearly got word of that and felt confident in themselves to, after all these years had passed, come forward and report their crimes. It is one of the key factors and a point for debate, of course, where people have said that, you know, those accused of rape, just like those alleged victims of rape, should be given anonymity until that court process is concluded one way or the other. But of course, prosecutors and police will argue that, especially in a case like David Carrick's, the fact that the name was out there after he was charged was a key factor in identifying him to victims who then felt that they could come forward themselves. So that's why this case is remaining open. It may well be that given that this man was offending over such a long period of time, close to 20 years, that there may well be other victims that are still out there that feel now that they can come forward, having seen what has happened here and the fact that this man has been brought to justice.
And you were reflecting on the comments from the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, about 20 minutes ago. It's vital we uncover how he was able to wear the uniform for so long, and reflecting, obviously, there is an inquiry already underway.
Yes, indeed, and that will be an urgent inquiry in terms of the findings that lots of people will be waiting to digest and to act on as a way forward to try to ensure that this kind of thing can't happen again, because, as I say, all too often we've had these scandals that have been reported that have involved not just Metropolitan Police officers, but very significantly Metropolitan Police officers, and also police officers in other forces around the country. So chief constables, including of course the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, looking at ways that they can weed out those corrupt officers who should never be wearing the uniform in the first place. And we know with regard to David Carrick that he passed his initial vetting procedure to join the Metropolitan Police, despite the fact that there were allegations that were made against him. There were then another 8 separate occasions where allegations were made, complaints were made, and that process was either not concluded to a satisfactory manner, or these allegations were not acted on properly by the Metropolitan Police, but to the point that in 2019 he then was re-vetted as a Metropolitan Police officer, passed that vetting process again. So certainly the vetting procedures, the way in which they look into the background of individuals, cross-check them, that is being reviewed. And as we speak, actually, there is a countrywide check of all current serving police officers right across the country against criminal record databases to make sure that there is nothing that the initial vetting process may have missed, and that if there are officers who have committed crimes, who have allegations against them, then perhaps those crimes can be flagged up.
Mark at Southwark Crown Court, thanks very much indeed. Now, let's update you on the efforts to recover people in the earthquake disaster. President Erdogan of Turkey declaring disaster zones for 10 cities in the south of Turkey, saying there will be a 3-month state of emergency because of the widespread damage that's been caused. Well, let's bring in the pictures of this huge fire in one port, Iskenderun, which is because of the containers that have toppled over, and of course the contents and catching fire, huge billows of the black, thick, acrid smoke. And the death toll, I'm afraid, continuing to rise, with 2 earthquakes, of course, yesterday at 7.8 and 7.5 magnitude, and a third tremor striking today at 5.7 as the rescue workers were trying to remove people from the rubble. The official death toll at the moment, 5,000, but the World Health Organization warning that could rise to more than 20,000. Some 6,000 buildings having collapsed. But let's show you some footage now of why the rescue operation is so important. This remarkable footage of a young boy being pulled from the rubble of one block of flats in northern Syria. They managed to get him out of this tiny gap and he survived, which is wonderful, of course, to see that people are still being saved. International aid effort increasing. The UK sending a search and rescue team, some 76 personnel, with sniffer dogs as well. Even South Korea joining the US in sending aid after the international appeal for help. What can be done on the ground? Let's go to southern Turkey now and speak to Salah Abulgasen, an aid worker for Islamic Relief. Thank you very much for talking to us. I know that you are busy, so taking the time out, we'll try and get you back to work as quickly as possible. Just tell us, what you're learning on the ground about what's needed and where.
Well, it's really a race against time. We're doing our best. We're doing whatever it is that we can. We're here in the south of Turkey. In all honesty, it's devastating. We're hearing harrowing stories of individuals and the suffering that they've had to go through. It was 2 earthquakes. You thought that you can never really recover from the first, and as soon as you think you've recovered, another one comes, and then there are after tremors and all the psychological effect and impact that has on individuals. There's lots of screaming, there's lots of damage. We're still unable completely to know the scale of the devastation, in all honesty. It's really now the focus is with the Civil Protection Society and agencies here in the south of Turkey specifically. It's about search and rescue. In this first critical 72 hours, we're working as hard as we can. Organizations like Islamic Relief are here on the ground assisting the Civil Protection Agency. But one of the challenges, as you can imagine, is that the roadblocks all around the roads and the access is very, very difficult to reach the epicenter and the surrounding sort of areas. Added to that, now we're finding there are fuel shortages. So some of the cranes and some of the tractors that we need that are so vital in such a time in order to clear that rubble, unfortunately, we've got fuel shortages. Consistently, there are electrical shortages. There are communication towers that have been sort of cut off at times. So it's really desperate. We're trying to get as many people as possible evacuated. Last night, it was really difficult. It was really cold. You know, these are the coldest months of the year. These are the coldest months of the year here in the south of Turkey and in the north of Syria. And what we're finding, therefore, is that people, obviously, having lost their homes, having lost everything, last night we're trying to put as many of them as possible into sort of emergency shelter, may that be local mosques or be schools or wherever it is that we could find in order to be able to place them. We're then providing food, we're doing medical assessments. there's a lot going on. It's extremely busy, it's extremely challenging, and our message and our appeal to the international community is to support the aid efforts of organizations like Islamic Relief and others that are working on the ground to help us and assist us in being able to help the people. These hours are critical. We're working as hard as we can. The needs are vast, and we're trying to do as much as we can. I must also bring to people's attention the severity of the matter. I mean, you're seeing it on the news. The footage that you see does not by any means show the scale. You have to be here to see it, to feel it, to understand it, to talk to people, to hear their difficulties. You saw that remarkable footage of someone being recovered. We're seeing unbelievable mass graves. People, families are being buried in northern Syria because, there are not enough graves for the amount of bodies that are being recovered. It's shocking, it's unbelievable. And these are the stories we're hearing from some of my colleagues that are just 100 kilometers away from us. They're talking to us about the fact that one of the urgent needs, believe it or not, is body bags. They haven't got enough body bags for the amount of bodies that they're recovering. I want to bring to your attention the situation of Syria specifically because of the fact that, it's been 13 years of war there in Syria. There was already a humanitarian crisis. There was really overcrowded in that area there on the border areas from Turkey. And as you can imagine, due to all of that and the severity of the situation, this has escalated it to a completely other level. Here in Turkey, it's a coordinated effort. In Syria, it's a lot more difficult. So we're seeking the help and support from everyone to help us to reach out to as many people as possible.
Yes, because, of course, you've got the problem with the refugees in that border area, and I think you even had cholera breaking out because of the problem with the water supplies, which I guess is now going to be exacerbated because, obviously, the infrastructure, the water mains, the gas mains and everything is actually fractured as well. And as you were saying, because people are trying to stay safe out in the open areas, they're having to deal with these very cold conditions now as well. It's
sub-zero conditions. It's extremely cold. It's really, really difficult. And when people have injuries, when people, are in need of food and in shelter, psychologically to have gone through what people have in these last 24 to 30 hours now, the minimum that they need is a warm, safe place. And we're able to provide as much as we can, but the scale of the need is a lot more than the provision that we're able.
Salah, just tell us, we have got these flights going in. There is a team from Britain with specialist search dogs and sniffer dogs. Is that the real important work at the moment, to get into these, literally, as we're seeing some live pictures now, piles of rubble to try and get to the people that are still trapped underneath?
Well, yeah, that's one area of work that's a real priority, and that's happening right now. It's this first key critical 72 hours that we have to try and reach as many people as possible, and try to remove as much rubble and uncover and try to evacuate those that are there. Secondly, those who have been able to take out from the rubble, providing the medical assistance, providing the food, providing the shelter, providing a safe space for them, and trying to then, I can't even say repiece their lives back together because everything's been lost. It's devastating. But at least trying to provide them, a means and form of survival. This is going to be a long, drawn emergency situation. This isn't going to be solved in a matter of days. The severity is huge. There are areas that we haven't reached ourselves. There are areas that are very hard to reach, and we haven't got the full scale of severity of the situation. And again, I say, we're talking about Turkey, for which I'm in south of Turkey at the moment. It's non-stop. We're working as hard as we can. And Syria also, it's so difficult. It's overcrowding. People living in unfit conditions, people who are already in a humanitarian crisis, the camps. One shocking thing I just want to leave the viewers with, just to put into perspective. A couple of weeks ago, one of the upscaling work that we were doing is winterization. We're providing shelter to those who had no shelter. Now what's happening, just to put things into perspective, is we're finding those who are living in tents, welcoming and hosting those that were in shelters. That's what's going on.
Remarkable.
Yeah. But this is the strength of the people. They're doing what they can, and we're just really seeking the help and support from everyone around the world, whoever can support and donate and give whatever it is they can to help us with these vital, life-saving aid efforts.
Salah, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us here on GB News. We appreciate it because we know you've got a big job, as you were saying, and you need to get back to helping people. But for the moment, thanks for updating us, and we wish you the best. Thank you very much indeed. And, of course, we'll update you as we get more. Just to remind you, this is a region now, they estimate some 12 million people may have been affected indirectly or directly. 6,000 buildings collapsed, 5,000 officially dead. But the World Health Organization warning that could rise to more than 20,000 people in addition to all those who've been injured. More on that coming up as we will update you on all the other headlines of the day. Stay with us here on GB News Live.
This year on GB News, we've got brand new members in the family.
Join us. Across the entire United Kingdom, we cover the issues that matter to you. GB News will always stay honest, balanced and fair. We want to hear whatever is on your mind.
And we don't talk down to you.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
Britain's watching.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prisons?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed. So I guess they've always been quite woke. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, and we'd like to say thank you to each and every one of you for bringing us your conversations, for helping our great nation find its voice. We are here for you on radio, television, and online, across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
It's not the BBC, you actually get your facts right.
We are proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
And welcome back to GB News Live. Now let's update you on the underwater dive team searching for Nicola Bulley. Today they've been looking upstream on the River Wyre from where she went missing. The specialist divers so far finding no trace, though, using this sonar equipment you can see in their boat. Also, a fresh appeal from her partner, Paul Ansell, who said that their two daughters desperately missed her and needed her back. Now, 11 days since Nicola went missing at St Michael's-on-Wyre in Lancashire. Let's get the very latest there now with our North West of England reporter, Sophie Reaper, who's been following the story. Sophie, how do we know that, or how has that search been going on the upstream section, as you were explaining to us a little earlier?
Well, this morning they began by searching about a mile upstream from the bench where police originally believed Nicola may have fallen into the river. They then moved down to the area in front of the bench and they spent around 2 hours. You can just hear, perhaps over my right shoulder, and you can see them, the divers who are now, that's what that sound is I assume it's something to do with the diving equipment. But as I was saying, they spent around 2 hours this morning using that sonar equipment on the boat, travelling in laps up and down this section of the River Wyre. When he was asked, the founder of SGI, Peter Falding, told the media that it's been going well, but there are a few areas, there's that sound again, there are a few areas where they've been unable to see exactly what's going on, so they need now further investigation. And as you've heard there, the divers are now continuing to look for answers because those people like Nicola's friends and family need answers. A little bit earlier, I was speaking to one of Nicola's friends and this is what she had to say.
It feels, I mean, there are no words really. It's one of the situations throughout life you don't want to have to live through. And we are so grateful to the SGI team and obviously the police who are working closely with them and the community and just working tirelessly really to try and find out what's happened to Nikki. Yeah, it's an emotional roller coaster for sure. We need to keep, more than ever, as a family and as friends, we're keeping hope. We're trying our best to stay positive. We want to bring Nikki home. Her 2 little girls need her. They're desperate for her back, to cuddle them in at night. And obviously, just we just need some answers. We need factual facts. We need evidence. Anyone that's out there that feels they may have dashcam footage. There's a section of road that we're missing, Garstang Road towards St Michael's, and we just need some answers.
Well, the search continues for the 45-year-old. We haven't heard anything yet from either the sonar team or the diving team, but they will continue to search for those answers because, as we just heard there, until the friends and family have some answers, they will never give up hope for Nicola Bulley.
Indeed. And Sophie, just to reiterate, we can see some more activity behind you. Not just the river itself, they're still searching sections of the riverbank too.
Yeah, absolutely. Over my right-hand shoulder, you can see the diving team, but absolutely there has been police presence today who have been searching the entire area. This isn't just a one-man team. There are lots of people, all desperate to find answers for the friends and family of Nicola.
Sophie, at the scene, thank you very much indeed for updating us. Back to you, of course, throughout the afternoon as that continues. Now, let's tell you about the family of Archie Battersby attending the inquest into his death today in Essex. His mum, Holly Dance, saying that threatening WhatsApp messages targeting her 12-year-old son had been released as part of the disclosure process before today's hearing. Our national reporter Theo Chicombo is at the coroner's court for us in Essex. And Theo, of course, remember the desperate landmark sort of legal battle to keep him alive. And now the questions about what happened to him before that.
That's right. Good afternoon. Well, the inquest began today, and as you mentioned, there was a lengthy legal battle last year, particularly with the family in court over his continuing life support treatment. Today, the mother, Holly Dance, is here alongside some members of the family, and we're also going to be hearing from other people, including ambulance staff and her neighbours as well today. So we understand, you know, some of the things that went through today in his situation when it comes to school, his transfer from the house to the hospital, and of course her knowledge as well of the influence of social media. Previously from today, she had said that she believed Archie may have been taken in an online blackout challenge, which was something that was going around at the time, particularly on social media. But she has told the inquest today that she can't say for sure that he was. And she says, I still don't know if Archie was trying the blackout challenge on April the 7th, before that day, and she still doesn't know what he was watching on TikTok. She also spoke about his love for martial arts, his success in gymnastics. He went on to win some competitions, and this was something that he was very keen on doing, whether at home or in the gym as well. She said Archie typically thought he was Spider-Man, that they had banisters at home and he would frequently be hanging on them. He was energetic and successful in what he did, and he never said no for an answer in terms of sporting. She did also say there wasn't anything on that day, on the 7th of April, that there's anything to suggest that he was thinking about suicide or anything like that. It was just a normal day in their family home. But she did finish on this by saying none of us should be afraid to learn for the future. And the inquest is continuing this afternoon. We'll hear from paramedics.
Theo, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. Back to you as, of course, we hear more at that coroner's court. Thanks very much indeed. Now, let's bring you some business news with the oil giant BP making pretty hefty profits. This is on the back of Shell's figures, of course, recently. BP making $23 billion last year in terms of underlying profit, more than double the previous year, benefiting from the runaway gas prices caused by the war in Ukraine. Well, it's putting BP at the centre of another political battle after the Shell figures sparked calls for additional windfall tax. Well, joining us now to go through the detail is energy analyst Andy Mayer. Andy, thank you for your time. I see also that BP have announced a share buyback of £2.29 billion, indicating they have got a bit of cash to spare.
Well, that's true, and it's often what large companies do when they haven't got the investment opportunities to spend the money in a more productive fashion, securing their future essentially by putting it in the only place that they've got left. And one of the reasons that they haven't got enough opportunities is the enormous amount of hostility, particularly in Europe, not so much in America, to new oil and gas projects. They could put that money into other things, but they're very hard-headed about this. These companies look at the potential for projects in the alternative energy space, and BP is a major investor in renewable projects, carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, that kind of thing. But not all of those projects will be shovel-ready in the lingo. They will be projects that have a very low chance of success. So these companies are trying to deliver on the future without oil and gas, but in the interim, some of the projects that are far more up their street are the major oil and gas investments, but not in the UK and not in large parts of Europe, where hostile regulation and windfall taxes have essentially undermined the case for new investment.
Just looking at the sort of political fallout, Downing Street defending the tax treatment of oil and gas companies. Prime Minister's official spokesman saying the energy profits levy already taking companies up to a 75% marginal tax rate, which, you know, is pretty eye-watering.
Well, these are the politics of a banana republic. It's not just the high rate, it's the random way in which it's been provided unpredictably. So companies say that they can cope with higher tax rates. And if you look at Norway, for example, their tax rate of 78% is higher, but it's also been there for 30 years. So companies know what they're getting if they do a deal with the Norwegian government. If you try to invest in Britain, you have no idea what tax you'll be paying in 5-10 years' time. We've been in this cycle before where a government imposes a windfall tax. It then causes a collapse in investment. It then has to row back with special investment allowances. And when they work and the profits start coming back in again, they introduce a new windfall tax. So this is now the third major cycle of UK tax incontinence that these companies are looking at and thinking, do we really want to invest in this country? Particularly when the country is also putting out rhetoric on net zero, which strongly suggests that it believes that we can unilaterally solve climate change in one country, which is bonkers and means that these kind of profits in future will be going to other countries, not invested back here.
Yeah, well, I was going to point out the fact we've got Grant Shapps in that new job, Minister or Secretary of State for Net Zero, whatever that will be. But just looking at the figures, would a windfall tax actually work in that BP, like many other companies, I think it only makes 10% of its profits effectively within the UK as an international company?
That's correct. And you can only windfall tax the profits that are made on your own shores. If you try otherwise, you end up breaking international tax treaties, which can cause a trade war, the damage from which brings the sums involved in these profits pale into insignificance compared to that. So it's a terrible idea to do what some people on the left are saying, which is we can just tax the whole lot and there will be no consequences. Clearly, that's not true. It's both illegal and extremely dangerous and damaging to our international reputation.
However, given the political pressure, do you think Grant Shapps is going to have to address the issue after these figures from both Shell and BP? Because clearly there's political fallout.
Well, I think they really do need to grow a spine on this. I mean, the opposition and the government both seem to be reacting to each other. Every single time there is an unpleasant headline, one of them comes out and says the solution is higher taxes. Well, the consequences of that are very dangerous to the UK. If people don't trust that they can trust the government on a stable fiscal operating environment, they will not invest. And if it's both parties saying it, then they are assured of that. So the future of British investment climate for energy is looking very bleak indeed unless they change tack and stop making these announcements.
Thank you very much, Andy, for that particular view. And, of course, we'll see what Greg Shapps comes up with, the new department as such in Westminster. Thank you very much indeed. Just remind you, Grant Shapps is the new Energy, Security and Net Zero Secretary in that reshuffle this morning. Now, excuse me, the latest on the strikes, because patients across England and Wales facing more disruption today. Nurses striking for a second day in their ongoing dispute. Royal College of Nursing, of course, demanding a rise of 5% above inflation and an improvement, indeed, in the conditions. Let's get more now at St Thomas's Hospital. Our London reporter Lisa Hartle is there for us. Lisa, day two, and it seems they're still out in force there.
Hello, Hello, yes, indeed. So yesterday, obviously, we had the nurses' strike day one. That was with the ambulance workers. Ambulance workers are back at work again today and due to strike again on Friday. So it's the nurses on their day two today. I'm joined by Stuart, who's an A&E nurse. Thank you, Stuart. So why are you out striking today?
I think the main reason I'm out striking today is I've been an emergency nurse for 23 years. I love my profession, I love my job. But over the past 10 years, I've watched chronic underfunding, no support for the nursing staff. With those things happening, I've seen nurses hemorrhage from the NHS, especially since coming out of lockdown. I've lost a lot of senior staff. There's hard to recruit, hard to retain. The main things coming through that is the nursing staff can't afford to feed people on their table, put heating on. I've had nurses leave to turn around and join office jobs when they wanted to stay being nurses. So I felt it was just a point now that I need to stand up with my colleagues to say this is not good enough. Patients are being affected, the safety of patients are being affected. The lifestyle of my nurses has deteriorated over the past decade or so, and I need to do something as a senior member of staff to stamp my feet and say this is not right. We need better stuff, we need better funding. We need to look after the nursing staff that we have now because it's hard to retain them now. If it gets worse, we're not even going to be able to recruit, and then where people are.
Well, you know, yesterday the Health Secretary said that if the amount that the nurses were being asked for was given, then that would cause inflation to go even higher. And he seems pretty stuck on sticking to that pay review that was carried out last year.
I think that's really unfair. I think the pay review was government initiated. It's not an independent body. Over the past 10 years, we've been chronically underfunded. To then throw it back in the nurses' face that we're going to cause the cost of living to go up because we're asking for what we should have had 10 years ago is unfair in my eyes. If they had done what they're supposed to do over the past 10 years, this would not be an issue today. We understand that a lot of people in the country are suffering the same problems as us, but what seems to be different for the nursing staff, this has been 10 years of this. And I used to come into work and have 10 senior nurses being able to teach me my job role. Now juniors are coming into this role and there's not so many people there with that level of knowledge now. And that's going to leave gaps. And when that's leaving gaps, that's going to affect patient safety. And when we're affecting patient safety, that affects the nurses too much, so they leave. It's just this chronic problem that's going round and round in circles. So to blame us that we're going to cause inflation to rise this year when it's been a 10-year problem, I feel is a bit unfair to nurses.
And how hard was it for you to go on strike today? And also, how do you know when you're allowed to go out? Does there have to be a certain number of nurses on staff before you can do that?
We're very lucky. We're very lucky in the hospital I work in. They've turned around and got enough doctors to support the gaps in the nurses' knowledges today and the nurses' staffing. So I feel like that won't have as much impact. The Joe Public support us. They haven't been coming in as much into A&E as they would have done normally. So I think there's a fairity that we will cope with this. We've coped with worse situations in the NHS over my 23 years experience. We deal with these problems. What we can't deal with is the chronic underfunding that's making my nurses hemorrhage to the point that we haven't got enough nurses on shift to look after the patients that we need to. I look after patients the same way I look after my own family. At the moment we're not doing that and we need to get back to that standard.
Thank you so much
it's
for
always,
your time.
Lisa.
Thank you. Well, the message again today, as has been before, that if you have an appointment, then to keep it unless you have been contacted and told otherwise.
Lisa, thank you very much indeed for that. And just to remind you that Will Quince, the Health Minister, telling the Commons that so far the estimate is 88,000 procedures or outpatient appointments postponed because of the strikes over the past 8 weeks. Just to remind you, the physiotherapists are taking action on Thursday, and then the ambulance crews and call handlers back on Friday in terms of industrial action. We'll keep you updated on that here on GB News Live. Weather for you next.
He's the king of breakfast TV, and he's back. Eamon Holmes, back on the TV
Surprised
with me this morning.
Even remember my name.
I know, it's been 4 months. You have holy water by your bed?
Oh, yes.
Oh,
already to bless.
Yeah. Oh, Eamon. Oh.
Why do you not believe anything I say?
Eamon Holmes back on GB News Breakfast at 6 a.m.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit off.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Monday to Thursday on GB News, it's Bev Turner Today from 10 a.m. We're going to be here for you, our GB News family, to keep you up to date, but also make you smile.
The guy went from puberty to adultery.
And I can't wait to bring a few of my own opinions.
I have no time for cultural totalitarianism.
We'll engage in passionate, but always polite debate, with your thoughts and opinions at the centre of it all. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's 2 o'clock here on GB News Live. I'm Mark Longhurst, and coming up for you this hour, David Carrick, serial rapist, former Met police officer, given 36 life sentences, a minimum jail term of 30 years for his multiple violent and brutal sex offences against a dozen women. Impact statements by victims read out in court. One woman saying she'd felt encountering evil after being raped by Carrick. She'd met him in a bar in London. We'll have more on the sentencing from Southwark Crown Court and reaction to a police officer who abused his position over 17 years. All change as Rishi Sunak reshuffles the cabinet and reorganises Whitehall departments. Tory member favourite Kemi Badenoch now leading a new business and trade department. And the wait for a new Conservative Party chairman is over. Step up Westminster veteran Greg Hands, said to be a safe pair of hands. In the other headlines, Grant Shapps as a new standalone energy secretary, covering net zero, while Michelle Donnellan inherits the Science, Innovation and Technology Department. All change. In the other headlines, Britain sending search and rescue specialists and dog teams to Turkey. The death toll rising above 5,000. World Health Organization saying it could reach 20,000. We'll have the latest on this ever-growing tragedy. And the nurses on strike for a second day in England. Have you had an operation or procedure cancelled? 88,000 we're told so far. Email us with your experiences, gbviews@gbnews.uk. But let's get the latest headlines first with Tamsin.
Mark, thank you, and good afternoon from the GB newsroom. It's 1 minute past 2. Former Met police officer David Carrick has been handed 36 life sentences for sexual offences against a dozen women. The 48-year-old pleaded guilty to 49 charges, including 24 counts of rape, all carried out while he was serving in the force. He'll have to serve a minimum of 30 years behind bars. Mrs Justice Chima Grubb referred to what she called a spectacular downfall for a man charged with upholding the law, telling Carrick he'd lost his liberty, job and status. Rishi Sunak has revealed his new cabinet following a reshuffle this morning, whilst creating 4 new departments.
Hello.
The promotion, sir.
Thank you.
Got a lot of work to do before the local election.
We certainly do.
Greg Hands takes over as the new Conservative Party chairman after Nadeem Zahawi was sacked. The Business, Trade and Culture departments have been broken down into separate units, with Grant Shapps now Energy Security Secretary, with the department aimed at bringing down bills and securing a long-term energy supply. Kemi Badenoch is the new Secretary of State for Business and Trade. Lucy Fraser has become the Culture Secretary, taking over from Michelle Donnellan, who's been made a new Science and Technology Secretary. The Foreign Secretary says 3 British nationals are missing following the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria. James Cleverly has also told the Commons 35 others are caught up in the disaster. Turkey's president has declared a state of emergency for 3 months in the 10 cities impacted. More than 5,100 people have been killed. The first 7.8 magnitude quake hit yesterday morning, with a second major earthquake measuring 7.5 just a few hours later. Almost 6,000 buildings have been destroyed in the tremor and aftershocks. An aid worker for Islamic Relief, Salah Abul Ghassan, told GB News about the rescue efforts.
There are fuel shortages, so some of the cranes and some of the tractors that we need that are so vital in such a time in order to clear that rubble, unfortunately we've got fuel shortages. Consistently there are electrical shortages, there are communication towers that have been sort of cut off at times, so it's really desperate. We're trying to get as many people as possible evacuated.
Surrey police have confirmed the deaths of Epsom College head teacher Emma Patterson and her daughter Letty are being treated as a murder investigation. The 2 bodies were found, along with Emma's husband George, in the grounds of the school in the early hours of Sunday. The force have said George Patterson had recently been in contact with the police about his shotgun licence in order to change his address to the site of the school. An underwater search for missing mother Nicola Bulley is still underway in the River Wyre. It's been 11 days since Miss Bulley went missing after taking her dog for a walk in St Michael's-on-Wyre in Lancashire. The search follows a fresh appeal by her partner, who said her 2 daughters desperately miss her and need her back. Forensic search specialist Peter Folding says they need to rule everything out.
Somebody could have put the phone on the bench. Somebody could have found it and put it on the bench, just on the nearest bench. We don't know. Nobody knows. This is a complete mystery, this whole thing. And normally, if somebody falls in the water, if Nicola went in here, her body would have gone straight to the bottom, it would remain there, and police divers would have found her that day.
The BBC chairman has denied giving Boris Johnson financial advice before getting the job at the broadcaster, calling their relationship broadly professional. Richard Sharp has appeared for questioning before a cross-panel party of MPs. It's after it was revealed he was involved in helping secure Mr Johnson a loan of up to £800,000 before the then Prime Minister backed his appointment to the role at the BBC. His selection is under investigation. Shadow Climate Secretary Ed Miliband is calling on the government to bring forward a proper windfall tax on energy companies after BP announced its biggest yearly profit in history. The energy giant has more than doubled its earnings from the year before, earning £23 billion in profits in 2022 after energy prices surged due to the war in Ukraine. BP Chief Executive Bernard Looney says stronger plant reliability and a lower cost of production helped with profits. The Shadow Defence Secretary is to argue that cuts to the British Army must be halted to show the UK is a leading European member in NATO. In a speech at the Royal United Services Institute, John Healey will outline Labour's plans to ensure the UK's duty to the alliance are fulfilled in full. It follows Defence Secretary Ben Wallace conceding the armed forces had been hollowed out and underfunded. This is GB News. More from me shortly. Now, though, it's back to Mark.
So, David Carrick, former Met police officer, one of Britain's most prolific sex offenders, now sentenced to 36 life sentences. It means he will serve a minimum of 30 years and 239 days for a total of 85 sexual offences against a dozen women over a 17-year period. Within the last half hour, we've had Detective Chief Inspector Ian Moore from Hertfordshire Police, who was investigating him, basically saying, I have absolutely no doubt that Carrick committed other offences that we don't yet know about. There will be support, he said, from within the police, as well as independent sexual violence advisors who can support victims, and I would urge people to trust us. Well, at the court, Mrs. Justice Chima Grubb told Carrick it was a spectacular downfall for a man charged with upholding the law and that he had lost his liberty, his job and his status. This report now from our Home and Security editor, Mark White.
As a Metropolitan Police officer, PC David Carrick was supposed to protect the public. Instead, he preyed on them, using his status as an armed officer to trick, control and silence his victims. A serial offender, he admitted to a staggering total of almost 50 offences, including 24 separate counts of rape. At Scotland Yard, the force may be under new management, but it is an all too familiar picture. A humiliating act of public contrition amid promises that the Met is focused on cleaning up its act.
We haven't applied the same sense of ruthlessness to guarding our own integrity that we routinely apply to confronting criminals, and I'm deeply sorry for that.
PC Carrick worked as a firearms officer in the Parliamentary and Diplomatic Protection Command, whose officers guard key buildings like Parliament, embassies and Downing Street. It's the unit where PC Wayne Couzens, another corrupt officer, served. He went on to kidnap, rape and murder marketing executive Sarah Everard in March 2021. The court heard how PC Carrick repeatedly humiliated his victims, locking some women in the understairs cupboard at his home here in Stevenage, or forcing them to clean his house naked, referring to his victims as slaves and telling them when they could eat and sleep. His crimes went undetected by the force he worked for, despite his behaviour being brought to the attention of senior officers on 9 separate occasions. In 2000, Carrick was accused of burglary and sending abusive messages, but the next year he passed the vetting procedures to join the Metropolitan Police. While serving, he was first accused of harassment and assault in 2002. He came to their attention again 2 years later after an alleged domestic incident. Despite a string of other allegations, none of them proven, he passed fresh vetting checks in 2017. In July 2021, he was placed on restricted duties after being arrested on suspicion of rape. But 2 months later, those restrictions were lifted after the charges were dropped. It was only in October that year that Carrick was finally suspended after prosecutors charged him following another allegation of rape at this hotel in St Albans by a woman he'd met on a dating app.
An absolute shocking case, this one.
Policing analyst Graham Wetton said this appalling breach of trust underlines the urgent need to change the standards and the culture within the UK's biggest police force.
This was a dreadful case, and it has to be a priority for the new Commissioner and the management team to address the issues with the Met, restore trust and confidence by looking at any offending that's gone on and root these people out of policing.
PC David Carrick's crimes have had a devastating impact on the lives of his victims. But the failure of his commanding officers to act far sooner has destroyed the trust of many others within the wider community. Mark White, GB News at Scotland Yard.
Let's get more live now with Mark, who's outside Southwark Crown Court for us. And Mark, justice seen to be done for some 85 offences, but this chilling reflection from DCI Ian Moore, Hertfordshire police who investigated him. I have absolutely no doubt that David Carrick has committed other offences that we don't yet know about.
Yes, certainly authorities believe that there will be other victims. This was 17 years that while he was a serving police officer, he committed those crimes. But of course, there was a longer period before he joined the police where other crimes may have been committed as well. And of course, there's a potential always for crimes to have been committed during that time where he was a serving officer. That's why that case will be left open. I should say that we've just heard from the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, in a statement. He will be making the same statement to camera, but he says that David Carrick's crimes were unspeakably evil. The detail is harrowing. He subjected these victims and survivors to the most degrading and inhumane treatment, and yet they still showed the courage to come forward and to provide the evidence that led to the conviction. So Mark Rowley goes on to say he exploited his position as a police officer in the most disgusting way. He should not have been a police officer. He says we weren't rigorous enough in our approach, and as a result we missed opportunities to identify the warning signs over decades. And then says, I want to again reiterate my apology on behalf of the Metropolitan Police. We are, he says, truly sorry. So that, in more detail, that statement we will be hearing from the Met Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, on camera this afternoon. But as you mentioned there, of course, Hertfordshire Police, the lead agency in investigating these allegations against David Carrick, saying that this investigation will remain open in the expectation, they believe, that there are other victims out there. This is what we heard from the lead investigator from Hertfordshire Police and from the Crown Prosecution Service a little earlier.
I'm extremely relieved and pleased to be standing here today, knowing that as a result of the courage of the victims and the relentless hard work of my team, a serious and prolific sex offender is now safely behind bars. This has been one of the longest and most challenging investigations that I've ever been involved in. It is a testament to my officers' unwavering and dedicated pursuit for justice that David Carrick has been handed 36 life sentences today. I'm truly humbled by the bravery of the victims. Each one was prepared to live their horrendous ordeal and face Carrick in court. I would also like to thank the Crown Prosecution team at Thames Chiltern. We've worked side by side with the exceptional team of lawyers since October 2021, building a strong and compelling case. Our investigation does not stop here, however, and we've set up a special reporting portal to allow people to continue to share information with us. This portal will remain open and details can be found on the Hertfordshire Police website. I would urge anyone who thinks they've been a victim of David Carrick to come forward. We still want to hear from you and we will support you. As a serving police officer, David Carrick has brought shame on the profession and was not fit to wear the uniform. But I hope that our determination to get justice for the victims in this case will go some way to reassuring the public that nobody is above the law, and we will bring people like David Carrick to justice.
Today is about recognising the outstanding bravery of the victims. It often takes courage for anyone to come forward and report a rape, but in this case, to overcome the mental and physical oppression they endured may have felt insurmountable at times. We've heard the accounts of women who suffered at Carrick's hands. He took away their control, their right to choose, their freedom, in some cases both physically and mentally. We cannot undo the pain and anguish that they have endured, but I hope that they can take this first step in rebuilding their lives, knowing that he can't harm them or any other woman.
So there is some wider soul searching within the police service that needs to be done to look for those individuals that should never have been allowed to serve in the first place. It may still be serving. We heard from the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, that he believes there are hundreds of officers still working in his force who should not be there in the first place. Now, in his statement that he's giving to camera this afternoon, he says that today is not the time for going into any detail about what he will be doing and what his force will be doing to root out those corrupt officers. However, on the 31st of March, he says they will give a comprehensive update on just what the Metropolitan Police has done to go after those who should never have been allowed to serve in the force in the first place.
Mark at Southwark Crown Court, thank you very much indeed for that. And of course, we'll bring more comments from Sir Mark Rowley as we get them. But let's get the view now of a former Met Police Chief Superintendent, Parm Sandhu, who joins us once more here on GB News. Parm, thank you for your time. As Mark was saying, clearly the Chief Constable will be giving a bit more detail on that. But a lot of people will be wondering, why did Carrick's own colleagues not raise the alarm sooner? Surely they must have known something about what was going on, given the nickname they'd given him.
as you quite rightly say, he did have an awful nickname, which he would have earned, and so there would have been alarm bells with his colleagues. But it takes, you know, as the victims, it takes a lot of courage to stand up against police colleagues, because the supportive network is not there for whistleblowers. They're not supported to raise concerns about colleagues. And even today, when we hear of the horrific cases and the horrific things that David Carrick put his victims through, your heart goes out to those victims who had to relive that experience and had to hear all of it again. But even for colleagues of police officers, it's very difficult for them to actually raise their heads and say, this is wrong and this is what's going on, because who believes them and who's going to support them? And the culture of the Metropolitan Police in particular enables this sort of behaviour to be hidden underneath banter. So you don't know whether it's true or whether people are actually making jokes, because, you know, you become complicit by laughing along. And that's what's wrong about the culture. Something needs to be done. And I'm not satisfied with the apologies. I'm not satisfied that today we can't have a plan going forward. We've had the apologies and we're being told to wait until another report comes out, another review comes out. Well, trust and confidence for women, for men, anybody who's been raped, trust and confidence has gone right down. It needs to be rebuilt, and that needs to be by showing the actions that are being taken now.
So Mark was indicating that we may get more in terms of the details in March. What do you think Sir Mark should be saying or talking about then at Scotland Yard this afternoon?
He should really be saying, what are they doing today? What did they do yesterday? How is that plan going? It's not, you know, we don't need the balloons and the banners on the 31st of March. We need to know now what is happening. It's not as if this has just happened. This case itself has been investigated for 2 years, and before that we had a very high-profile case. So the plan should have been done, it should be implemented, and we should be told what that plan is. And there should be consultation with women's groups, with charities,
right,
with other groups that support victims, because every victim that comes forward has to relive their experience, which is why conviction rates for rape are so low in this country, absolutely appallingly low.
Yeah, although we reflect on the statements we've heard from Hertfordshire Police looking into his behaviour, how incredibly difficult it was for them to actually get to the bottom of what had been going on. And does this again question, I guess you'd call it the locker room mentality of, you know, what is banter and what is an indication of serious criminal behaviour?
It absolutely does. And when you've got pockets of this sort of behaviour with more than one officer involved, then you should be looking at that whole department and that whole team. There will be officers who were not involved, and the majority of officers are good, caring individuals, I have to say that, and they go to work for the right reasons. So, you know, I respect those officers, and they are the majority. However, you've got pockets of corruption within the Metropolitan Police, within policing, where officers are allowed to stay and allowed to flourish and encourage that sort of deviant behaviour in each other.
We heard from DCI Ian Moore, who was doing the investigation, indicating that he feared perhaps there are more victims out there. As a former female Met police officer, what would you say to those victims who are still out there who haven't come forward yet?
My message to any victim, whether they're a victim of David Carrick or not, is to pick the phone up. You will get, the chances are you will get a very good officer, you will be supported, and we need people to come forward so that we can take these criminals off the street. No one is above the law, absolutely no one. So please pick up that phone if you've ever been affected by this sort of crime and report it, and something should be done and will be done.
Palm, thank you very much indeed for your time here on GB News once more. And just to reflect that Hertfordshire Police do have a link, a portal on their website where people can get in contact with them. We heard from DCI Moore saying that he wanted people, of course, to actually get in touch and to raise any concerns they had that may lead to further investigations. More on that, of course, as we get it. Coming up, though, digesting both the Cabinet and Whitehall reshuffle and reorganisation. But let's take a quick break first.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway,
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi, Andrew Pierce here. Join me every Friday lunchtime for a proper no-nonsense debrief of the week's events. With special guests in the studio and the GB News team on the ground, I'll be getting you up to date with news, some intelligent discussion, and my own sharp take. The weekend starts here with me every Friday lunchtime on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512,
Virgin Media Channel 604,
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236,
And YouView, channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio,
with the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Let's update you on events in Westminster, with the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak not just reshuffling his cabinet, but reorganising Whitehall as well. Lots of appointments and changes. Let's get the latest with our political correspondent Tom Harwood, who's been following events there in Downing Street. And I guess reflect first of all, Tom, that we've got a new party chair, a safe pair of hands, to use your phrase from earlier.
A safe pair of hands indeed. It has been 9 days that the Conservative Party has been without a permanent full chairman, and really this was becoming a bit of an issue given how close those crucial local elections are creeping. People go to the polls right across the country in May, and really the Conservative Party needed someone in place to set that organisation and try and avoid it being as much of a disaster that everyone frankly expects it to be. So Greg Hands was the name that started to be really thrown around in earnest this morning. He is elevated from a position as a trade minister, has held various other positions in junior ministerial ranks in the last few years, and now enters cabinet for the first time. Interestingly, however, in the last hour, the Conservative Party have also announced a deputy chairman of the Conservative Party. Greg Hands, of course, as chairman, is a London MP, a blue wall MP, some might say. Well, to balance that out to some extent, Lee Anderson, the archetypal red wall MP, has been appointed as deputy chairman of the Conservative Party. And you can sort of see how this team points to both halves of the Conservative voting coalition, these two strands that the party really needs to hold together if it wants to win anything close to a majority at the next election. However, Lee Anderson is someone who shoots from the hip. He's been no stranger to scandal in the past. It'll be interesting to see how this tag team at the top of the Conservative Party work as things go forward.
Yeah, good cop, bad cop, some may say. But just looking at the skill set that's needed, of course, I mean, obviously Greg Hands has been, I think, deputy chief whip, so he's got the black arts at his disposal. But we heard about this sort of effort by Rishi Sunak to bring together all the various factions of the party. Is this giving us any clues as to how successful that's been?
I think it's too early to say, really. Across the broad breadth of the reshuffle, it's interesting to note that the number of government departments hasn't shrunk. In fact, it's grown ever so slightly. This has been the salami slicing of various departments, and it's notable that no one has left the cabinet table. Now, that might point to the fact that this is a perhaps weaker Prime Minister than he would like to be. He doesn't feel like he can let anyone go. In fact, he's bringing some people in, and as that cabinet table grows, as the number of heads around that table expands, it does seem that that is the position of someone who can't really say no to people within his party. But he is trying to shape government in his own image. Two big priorities in this mix-up of departments that we've seen this morning. First, energy and net zero. This is the department headed by Grant Shapps that is aiming to make this country more energy independent, aiming to have a broader strategy to avoid some of those issues that we've seen being hit more hard by energy crises than other countries. Of course, our infrastructure is creaking in this regard, and it takes far too long to construct, whether it's nuclear power stations or wind farms or anything else. Clearly, this is going to be a big point for the government to focus on as time goes ahead. But the other is innovation and skills, something that clearly Rishi Sunak cares about deeply. We heard a little bit about it in his New Year speech, but clearly these two big strands of government, whether it's energy or innovation, these are the two big messages I think we're seeing out of the reshuffle today.
Tom at Downing Street, thank you very much indeed for that. Well, let's see what Sir John Curtis, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde, makes of this. Of course, following the polls closely to see how the government is doing. Interesting, John, that it's not just about personality, but policy, a bit of a reset. And I guess they may be trying to show they're proactive this time instead of reacting to events.
Well, Tom has already quite accurately pointed out that what we get out of this reshuffle is not really so much information about the personalities in the party as getting some clues about what Rishi Sunak regards as priority. One is to try to ensure the security of the UK's energy supply, perhaps at a rather cheaper price. And secondly, to try to grow the economy through innovation, skills and science. I think it's also worth adding to that analysis what we lose. What we lose is the Department for International Trade, which of course was created in the immediate wake of Brexit. And that was a signal that one of the crucial aims of the government at that stage was to, as we came out of the European Union, to improve our trade deals with the rest of the world. Well, it looks as though perhaps that strategy at least has now somewhat been declined because international trade has been put back in more broadly with business and broader trade policy. And to that extent, at least, perhaps this isn't a government that's necessarily anticipating much in the way of international trade negotiations beyond the two that have already been achieved with Australia and New Zealand, and otherwise largely the rehashing of trade deals that we already had via the European Union.
And of course, that spectre, if you like, of what damage Brexit may have done to our economic prospects. And we've got now what both the IMF and the Bank of England itself indicating that, you know, stagnant growth, even though we may not tip into too bad a recession. Is it therefore too late for this government as they look towards these local elections to really try and climb back up that hill?
Well, we've still got 2 or 3 months to the local elections, and I think if we've learned anything in the recent years, an awful lot can happen in a short space of time. But I mean, there is no doubt Greg Hands, in finally getting a place in his own right at the cabinet table, has been dealt a very, very difficult hand. You know, the Conservatives have basically become becalmed in the polls at around 20, 22 points behind. Mr. Sunak's personal popularity has fallen markedly in the last 3 months, so his party's been becalmed, and he's got back to being his popularity has gone down towards in the direction of his party rather than he being able to pull his party up. He will be looking to Mr. Hands to try and see if he can help him convince the electorate that the government is now on a better course. But I mean, certainly, you know, what we hope to get out of the reshuffle in the way of improvements in innovation, improvements in energy policy, that's not going to happen in the next 3 months.
No. And Tom made the observation about Lee Anderson coming in as deputy chair. I'm sure Mr Anderson won't mind us saying, a reputation for plain speaking. And, of course, it underlines the importance in terms of electoral success of those red wall seats.
It does, and also, of course, given how far the Conservatives are behind in the polls, it also reminds us to how vulnerable those red wall seats are. But yes, it is a very different style. I mean, Greg Hands, I think, has always been regarded as a relatively emollient politician. He was, of course, a Remainer back in 2016. And it may well be that Mr Sunak felt important, therefore, to counterbalance him with somebody who was perhaps seen as rather more of a partisan figure, as well as being an avowed Brexiteer. But equally, perhaps, it might be the more emollient tone of Mr Hands that might be able to appeal to an electorate that at the moment at least is showing some signs of not being quite so strongly enamoured of Brexit as they were just as little as 6 months ago.
Yeah, questions being asked. Sir John, thank you for answering all our questions. As ever, pleasure to have you here on GB News. Well, we can now speak, or hear rather, from the Prime Minister, because he's been speaking about the reshuffle. Let's hear what he's had to say about it.
Well, I want the country to have greater energy security and independence, because we can't be held to ransom by hostile foreign countries. We also need cheaper energy because our energy bills are simply too high, and we need cleaner energy as we transition to net zero. That's why today I've created a brand new first-of-its-kind department for energy security and net zero, headed by one of our most capable and experienced ministers, Grant Shapps. Now, earlier this year, I set out my promises to the British people to halve inflation, grow the economy, reduce debt, cut waiting lists and stop the boats. The changes to government I've announced today will help us deliver on those promises.
Prime Minister, you've just shifted around the same faces. How is this going to do anything to reverse the slide in your party's fortunes?
I think we've seen over the last year in particular the impact that happens to people's bills at home when energy policy doesn't work properly, when we're reliant on imported energy from hostile countries. That's why the creation today of a new department focused specifically on energy security and net zero is so important. It's going to mean that we can reduce people's energy bills. That's so important. It means we can produce more energy here at home, giving us independence and security, and it means we can transition to cleaner forms of energy as we hit our net zero ambitions and create jobs in the process, as we're seeing here today. That's why today's changes are really important. We're focused on delivering for the British people, and this will help us do that.
Isn't the last thing that departments need, having faced so many ministerial changes, is a costly reorganisation?
No, I think what we need to do is deliver for the country. At the beginning of this year, I set out 5 priorities: to halve inflation, grow the economy, reduce debt, cut waiting lists, and to stop the boats. The changes to government I've announced today will help us deliver on those promises for the British people, particularly the creation of a brand new first-of-its-kind department for energy security and net zero, so we can really focus on that issue, bring down people's energy bills, produce more energy here at home, and make sure that that energy is clean and renewable as we transition to net zero. I know that that's a priority that the country has. It's a priority of mine. Today's changes will help us deliver it.
Why have you not dealt with the most pressing personnel issue facing your cabinet, Dominic Raab?
Well, with regard to Dominic Raab, I've asked the independent advisor some time ago to have a look at the historic issues that have been raised. The independent advisor is conducting his investigation. I can't prejudge the outcome of that investigation. It's right that it concludes, but as people have seen from how I've acted in the past, when I'm presented with conclusive independent findings that someone in my government has not acted with the integrity or standards that I would expect of them, I won't hesitate to take swift and decisive action. That's what I've done in the past, but with regard to this situation, it's right that we let the independent process continue.
Let's move on to Richard Sharp. The BBC chair has just told the Select Committee this morning that he told Boris Johnson he was applying to be BBC chair, and he told him he was in touch with Sam Blythe about a loan. In what world is that acceptable?
Well, this is obviously about an appointment that was made by a previous Prime Minister before I took this job, so it's hard for me to comment on the details of it. What I do know is that his appointment process was conducted rigorously and transparently. It was approved by a panel of experts and indeed a cross-party select committee in Parliament. But it is right that people have confidence in the process, and that's why the independent Commissioner on Public Appointments is re-looking at the process to make sure that everything was done correctly.
Do you think people can have any confidence in the process? It just looks like establishment proneness, doesn't it?
Well, as I said, at the time, the process was considered to be one that was conducted fairly rigorously, transparently, in line with all the guidance set out that exists for these things. A cross-party group of MPs in Parliament thought the process was good and recommended that Richard Sharp was appointed. An expert panel of independent people also said the same thing. But it's right that now the Independent Commissioner on Public Appointments is really looking at the process so people can have that confidence.
And just finally, on the terrible situation in Turkey and Syria, what support is the UK offering?
This is obviously an incredibly tragic situation that we're all seeing in Turkey and Syria. I want everyone to know that we are doing what we can to provide support. We're in touch with the authorities in both Syria and Turkey, and specifically we are in the process of sending 77 search and rescue experts to Turkey. That's the most immediate need that they have communicated to us that we can help with. It's providing help to them on the search and rescue side of it, where we do have people who are particularly experienced at that, and we'll be sending that support as quickly as possible.
Well, that's Rishi Sunak in his high-vis jacket there, because he's speaking at a renewable energy centre in King's Cross, answering those questions. And, of course, energy at the centre of this Whitehall reshuffle, with a new energy security and net zero department under Grant Shapps. Just to give you a few others that have been made in the last half hour or so. The reshuffle continuing with the appointment of Graham Stewart as Minister in that new Department for Energy Security. George Freeman, then Minister in the Department for Science, and Nigel Huddleston, Minister in the Department for Business and Trade, while Nusrat Ghani becomes a Minister jointly in Business and Trade and the Cabinet Office. So that's still continuing. More, of course, from Westminster as it comes, and the latest on the nurses' strike too. Second day of action. Let's take a quick break now.
This year on GB News, we've got brand new members in the family.
Join us. Across the entire United Kingdom, we cover the issues that matter to you.
GB News will always stay honest, balanced and fair. We want to hear whatever is on your mind.
And we don't talk down to you.
The establishment had their chance.
Now we're here to represent you.
Britain's watching.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Join me, Nana Akue, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today!
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere.
Amazing! You see, amazing!
You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel.
Magnificent. That's really, really thoughtful.
Come and join us on GB News, the People's News Channel.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. for Gloria Meets. In exclusive interviews, I'll be finding out who our politicians really are and what they really think.
It's something that you would never want anyone to suffer.
I didn't know what channels there were. I didn't think I'd be believed.
I must have weighed about 7 stone and I'm 5'8".
My instincts was to sort of cover this up. I mean, clearly that was a mistake.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
And welcome back to GB News Live with this second day of industrial action this week by nurses in England and Wales in the ongoing dispute over pay and conditions. With many patients facing disruption for their operations and appointments, Junior Health Minister indicating 88,000 disrupted so far in this period of industrial action. But nurses are providing emergency care. The Royal College of Nursing demanding a wage rise of 5% above inflation. Let's get the latest now with the North Devon District Hospital in Barnstable. Our South West reporter, Jeff Moody, is there. Jeff, you were there yesterday, of course, with the ambulance staff as well as the nurses. But the picket line for the nurses still in force there.
Very much so, yes, very much in force. There's even more people here than there were yesterday, and the response from the public, everybody's tooting their horns as they go past, or at least a lot of people are. There you go, another one right on cue. I want to speak to Angela, who's an advanced clinical practitioner here at the North Devon Hospital in Barnstaple. Angela, you've been here for 2 days now. It seems to me you're getting a very good response from the public. Is that how you see it?
Absolutely. I mean, I was here in the first phase of strike action at the Royal Devon back in December, and we had overwhelming positive support from the public. We were slightly concerned that this time it wasn't going to be as strong, but I think it's intensified. We've had nothing but positive responses from members of the public, from our colleagues that are inside working, from other professions, ambulance staff, the police, our doctor colleagues. It's all been wonderful. There's been a few negative responses, but it's the same as anything.
Yes, tell me about that, because when you finish the day on the picket line and you go home and you pick up a newspaper, or you look online, or you look at you watch some of the media, you'll hear all sorts of views about what you're doing and why you're doing it and what you should be doing it. What have you heard that upsets you and angers you the most?
So I think the media trying to turn the blame back on us as nurses for things like waiting lists getting longer, operations been cancelled. Yes, that has happened, but industrial action needs to have some sort of impact. People aren't dying, contrary to popular belief. The hospital is very well staffed. It's staffed adequately to look after the patients that are in there. And as I say, our colleagues that are working are supporting our action as well. So that's something that really upsets me, but reading stories from nurses about how the short-staffed wards are affecting their mental health, how nurses are having to go to food banks to support their families, how they're choosing to heat their homes or to eat. It shouldn't be like that. Nursing is a highly skilled, highly qualified profession, and our pay needs to reflect that. And we need that to attract people into the profession to keep it going. Nursing is the backbone of the NHS, and if we haven't got nursing, there's no NHS. So we're out here fighting for the NHS.
So this is the last planned day of industrial action today, isn't it? Do you foresee there being more industrial action in the future, in the coming weeks and months?
I think unless the government are willing to sit down and have a sensible negotiation about pay with Pat Cullen, and this has been offered numerous times, it's not our part that negotiations haven't taken part. This is solely on the government. So they need to sit down and be willing to negotiate a decent pay rise for nurses, and then we can call off any further action. But if that doesn't happen, then we will stand out here again, and we won't stop until they start listening to us and start talking to us.
Angela, thank you very much indeed for coming off the picket line for a minute to talk to me. Well, you've heard it there firsthand. It might be the last day of industrial action for now, but this dispute is by no means over.
And the car horn still sounding as ever, Jeff. Thank you for that in North Devon at Barnstaple. Let's move across now to St Thomas's Hospital, of course, on the south bank of the Thames, opposite Westminster, where our London reporter Lisa Hartle is there. And Lisa, you've got someone reflecting the views of how they feel there too.
Hello, yeah, sorry, it's quite loud here, so it's difficult to hear. But yeah, I'm joined with a critical care nurse, Linda. Linda, can you tell us why you're striking today?
I'm striking because last year 35,000 nurses left the nursing register. There are 50,000 nursing vacancies in the workforce, and my house is cold. We're not being paid enough to stay in the job, and it's difficult to do the job in the way that we signed up to do it if there aren't enough of us, and the people that pay for that in the end are the patients.
And tell us more about what patients are experiencing.
I mean, obviously it depends where you are, and people will experience it differently, but generally speaking, most shifts are understaffed in some way, to some degree, and that means that there are less people to pay attention to basic patient needs. But we can provide what we hope is safe care most of the time, but whether that is the same as providing good care is a different matter. and every individual patient will experience that in different ways.
And we were chatting, you and I, just before, and you were saying that there's quite often you'll start a shift and then there's not enough nurses ready to go on that shift.
I think that's true across the NHS, and I think the hospital I work in is slightly better than most in that regard. And there's a huge amount of time that's just spent patching together the workforce. So not only do you not have enough nurses on the wards, but the attentions of the senior nurses are taken up by making sure that there are enough staff, like I say, to provide a basic amount of care. And that means that the motivation to improve care is harder to gain because everybody is so stretched all of the time, and a huge amount of time is being wasted on sorting out the gaps in the workforce.
And how hard was it for you to make the decision to go on strike today?
I mean, it's a difficult thing to do, but I kind of been thinking for a while that this is what it's going to come down to, because you can see it coming. You know, there was the thing about COVID, when people were glad. There was an amount of appreciation for what we were doing, and as soon as the first pay negotiations came round, you didn't see that in what was offered, and then inflation's been rising, the government has becoming more hardline, all that kind of stuff. You could kind of see it coming, so it wasn't, for me personally, it wasn't that difficult a decision to make. But I know there are people, I've talked to people, that spent 2 weeks trying to decide before they sent the ballot back and said yes. And I've met people that have talked to me on the night before strike who have been almost crying with the idea that they're going to have to come and do it, because it goes against everybody's principles. That's not what any of us got into nursing for, to walk away. But we've got to a point now where nobody's listening, and they're still not listening. So we're standing here shouting at them.
Very loudly as well.
Good. I hope they hear.
Thank you so much for chatting to me. Thank you. So as we heard yesterday, there's been around 88,000 cancellations of procedures and appointments so far since the NHS started going on strike. So the hope is that, like in Wales and Scotland, where strikes have been paused or cancelled, hopefully the same will start happening here.
Lisa, thank you very much indeed. And as the nurses are indicating, hoping their voice will be heard across the Thames there at the Palace of Westminster. They're doing quite a good job vocally anyway, at least, and will reflect, of course, on the latest on the nurses' strike. But let's reflect more on Westminster and the politics. Rishi Sunak announcing that restructuring of the cabinet. Well, that cabinet is due to meet in about 10 minutes' time with these new members. Greg Hands named as the new Tory party chairman, Lee Anderson as his deputy, while Kemi Badenoch, a Tory favourite, new Secretary of State for Business and Trade. Grant Shapps, now the secretary of a new department, Secretary of State for Energy Security and Net Zero. That's the official title now. Lucy Fraser, Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, with Michelle Donnellan moving as Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology. Well, let's get the views now of Joanne Nadler, who's a political commentator and a long-time Tory supporter. Joanne, thanks for joining us once more. As I said, the new cabinet about to meet in about 10 minutes' time. And a lot of people are saying, well, have they got time to turn things round, bearing in mind we've got these local elections, of course, coming up in May?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons for the appointment of Greg Hands, who may not be particularly well known outside Westminster and Conservative circles, but he is known to be a very diligent campaigner and somebody who has built, particularly in London, quite a network of committed campaigners around him. Now, of course, we do have local elections, as you say, coming up in May, but we also have some pretty pivotal elections here in the capital next year around the mayoral race. So I think that will have been one of the reasons why he's been appointed. He's very much a team player and somebody who is, I think, very dependable in terms of going out on the media and championing his own team. So I can see a lot of good reasons for having appointed him as chairman. He may be considered to be a little low-key, perhaps, but I think the addition of Lee Anderson to that team at CCHQ, Conservative headquarters, is a significant one, and one that will perhaps reassure some of those who are looking, like myself, who are looking for something that's a little bit blue in tooth and claw.
Yeah, and an indication perhaps that the red wall seats still matter, because a lot of people had thought maybe with all the polling information coming through that the Tory party would abandon that idea because of the lead Labour had in the polls.
Well, I mean, I think it would be a bit much to say that they would actively abandon the red wall. The question, I think, more pointedly is whether they've got a policy agenda which will appeal to the red wall. And I think that's where, to a certain extent, this particular reorganisation is perhaps lacking slightly, because it's a very technocratic reorganisation. It'll be interesting to see what Grant Shapps comes up with in this new department, and whether indeed his department is going to put the emphasis more on the energy security, or whether it's going to be on the net zero, because you could argue that those things are slightly in conflict, particularly when it comes to appealing to people in the red wall.
And is it that they still think they're swimming against the tide? I see Downing Street saying the plans for the shake-up worked on for some time, but would not be a silver bullet to address all the problems faced by the country, close quotes.
Well, how could they possibly be? I mean, as I say, this is something of a technical reshuffle. What does it tell us about the direction of travel of the government? I mean, not a great deal, except perhaps to underline that if there is any such thing as Sunakism, it is this rather sort of more technical, detailed approach. Nothing wrong with that necessarily, but it doesn't exactly fill the heart with fire. For instance, you know, I have no idea where Lucy Fraser stands on culture, and culture's massively important in the run-up to the next election. I would love to have seen Kemi Badenoch move into that position, which is not to say she isn't doing an excellent job where she is. I'm pleased that her brief has been expanded, but we need to hear more about those things as well.
OK. Joanne, thank you very much indeed for bringing us your reaction, and scores out of 10. Thanks very much indeed. Or number 10. Now, we asked you about your experiences, of course, with this nurses' strike, second day of action. Thank you for all your reaction here. GBviews at gbnews.uk. Ray, first of all, who's saying, I've had basal cell carcinoma, the operation on my face, cancelled 4 times since November 2022. Excuse me, fingers crossed, he says, next date in February will be OK. The biggest worry is mental and what's going on under the skin. I have no sympathy at all for the strikers. They're far worse off patients than me, some of which will die as a direct consequence. My message to all strikers, the country's in crisis, get back to work. Lee from Portsmouth on the Carrick sentencing. If I saw and heard correctly, Carrick received 36 life sentences. That is right. And will serve a minimum of 30 years behind comfortable, heated, 3 meals a day bars. I make that less than a year for each of his crimes. No wonder our justice system, like almost everything else in this country, is a joke. Nicholas, meanwhile, on the reshuffle. Just over 100 days and already significant cabinet changes. A good captain can choose his crew. A poor one has to keep changing them. That's maybe like the aspect of the deck chairs on the Titanic that I think Labour pointed out, but there we are. We shall have more political reaction to those changes at Westminster, more, of course, on the nurses' strike, and more on the earthquake too, all coming up for you. Next, it's Patrick for you.
Good afternoon, Alex Deegan here with your latest weather update from the Met Office. Another frosty one tonight across the south, some dense patches of fog likely as well. A bit more cloud further north, which will keep the temperatures up. It's also going to be turning increasingly windy. Look at the isobars out to the northwest. As this weather front approaches, those winds will really be picking up in the northwest. But elsewhere, the isobars are well apart. Light winds allowing the frost to come back pretty sharply this evening. Temperatures tumbling. And the fog will also start to thicken up before midnight across parts of northern England, but especially the Midlands, southern parts and eastern parts of Wales, East Anglia and southern England. Some dense patches of fog likely by Wednesday morning. Cold as well, -2, -3 towns and cities. Rural spots much lower than that, but not as cold further north. There'll be the winds picking up and there'll be more cloud. But the winds will strengthen further during Wednesday, getting very